Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Tony Valdez, and I'm gonna tell you about the worst damn week of my life. Now, I've been through some shit in my 34 years. Lost my partner in a rock slide back in '08, nearly died of hypothermia in Yellowstone in '09, and I've pulled more bodies out of the wilderness than I care to count. But this was different. This was personal. It was late October 2011, and I'd been working private search and rescue for about 3 years since I left the Forest Service. Couldn't handle all the bureaucracy anymore, you know? When someone's missing in the mountains, every minute counts, and I wasn't gonna sit around filling out forms while some family's world fell apart. So I went freelance, and that's how I got the call about Sarah Chen. David Chen's voice was breaking when he called me that Tuesday morning. I could hear it right through my iPhone, that raw desperation that comes when your world's just been turned upside down. "Mr. Valdez," he said, and I could tell he'd been crying. "My wife. She's been missing for 3 days up in Glacier. The Park Service, they're not moving fast enough." Now, I've heard that tone before, and it gets to me every damn time. This wasn't just another case. This was a man who was about to lose everything that mattered to him. Sarah Chen was 28, a wildlife photographer working on some National Geographic piece about mountain goats. She'd gone up into the backcountry near Logan Pass with enough gear for 5 days. But she was supposed to check in every evening via satellite phone. Last anyone heard from her was Sunday night, and it was now Wednesday. "She's got a 6-year-old daughter," David told me, his voice cracking. "Emma keeps asking when mommy's coming home, and Jesus, I don't know what to tell her." That's when I knew I had to take this one. See, I've got what you might call certain abilities. Things I've developed over 15 years in the wilderness. I can track better than anyone I know, finding footprints in broken twigs that others walk right past. I can read the forest like a book, interpreting when animals are acting strange or when the whole energy of a place feels wrong. And I've got this sense, this gut instinct about when someone's watching me or when something just ain't right about a situation. But more than that, I remember everything. Every trail, every landmark, every weird little detail about places I've been. My spatial memory's like a goddamn camera. I can close my eyes and walk through terrain I visited years ago, remembering exactly where every rock and tree was. That's how I found people when others couldn't, by remembering patterns and connections that don't make sense to anyone else. I packed my gear that morning with the kind of care that comes from experience. My GPS unit, a Garmin E-Trex that had never let me down. My digital camera, extra batteries for everything, first aid kit, emergency shelter, enough food for a week. I also grabbed my old Motorola two-way radio, the kind park rangers used before everything went digital. Sometimes the old tech works when the new stuff fails you. The drive up to Glacier took me 4 hours, and David Chen met me at the west entrance. The man looked like hell. Hadn't slept, hadn't shaved, probably hadn't eaten much either. His little girl Emma was with him, this tiny thing with her mom's Asian features and her dad's worried eyes. She kept asking me if I was going to bring her mommy home, and damn if that didn't tear something inside me. "She's everything to us," David said while Emma played with her Nintendo DS in the back seat. "Sarah's parents flew in from Seattle yesterday. Her mom, she can barely function. They keep calling me every hour asking if there's any news. That's the weight I carry every time I take a case like this. It's not just about finding one person. It's about saving an entire family from falling apart. The pressure of all that hope and desperation, it either breaks you or it makes you better than you ever thought you could be." We drove up to Logan Pass, and that's where I got my first look at the terrain Sarah had been working in. Late October in Glacier is no joke. Snow already covering the high peaks, temperatures dropping below freezing at night, and a storm system moving in from the northwest that could dump 2 feet of snow in 12 hours. If Sarah was injured and couldn't move, hypothermia would kill her before I could find her. I started at her last known location, the spot where she'd set up her photography blind to watch a herd of mountain goats. Her equipment was still there, tripod, telephoto lens, even her backup camera. But Sarah was gone, and that's when I noticed the first thing that didn't feel right. See, Sarah's gear was arranged too neatly. When someone leaves in a hurry, or when they're taken, things get scattered. But her camera bag was zipped up tight, her thermos was capped and placed just so, and her trail map was folded and tucked under a rock like she'd taken her time. That set off every alarm bell in my head, 'cause in 15 years of search and rescue I'd learned that the scene tells you everything, if you know how to read it. I started tracking from there, and that's when my abilities really kicked in. Most people would see disturbed leaves and broken branches and think someone walked this way, but I see the whole story. The length of the stride, the weight distribution, whether the person was walking normal or under stress. Sarah's prints led away from her blind toward a game trail, but something was off about the pattern. Her gait was too regular, too controlled. When you're hiking in wilderness, especially when you're carrying camera equipment, your steps ain't perfectly spaced. You adjust for rocks, for roots, for changes in terrain. But Sarah's track showed someone walking with deliberate, measured steps, like she was being very careful about where she placed her feet, or like someone else was guiding her. That realization hit me about 2 hours into the track, and it changed everything. This wasn't a case of someone getting lost or injured. This was something much worse. Someone had Sarah, and they were smart enough to make it look like she'd just wandered off. I followed the trail for 6 hours, and the whole time I had this feeling that I was being watched. You know that sensation? When the hair on the back of your neck stands up and you keep turning around even though you don't see anything? That's my early warning system, and it was going off like crazy. The trail led deeper into the backcountry, away from any of the established hiking routes. Whoever had Sarah knew these mountains, knew exactly where they could go without running into other hikers or park rangers, but they didn't know about my spatial memory. I'd been through this area in 2007 during a search for some lost climbers, and I remembered every ridge and valley. That's when I found the first deliberate sign. About 8 miles from Sarah's blind, right where the trail crossed a small creek, someone had arranged 3 rocks in a perfect triangle. Not natural, not accidental, placed there on purpose. It was like a breadcrumb, a message saying, "This way." But breadcrumbs can lead you into traps just as easy as they can lead you home. I took a picture of those rocks with my digital camera and kept going, but now I was moving more carefully. My gut was telling me this was all wrong. Too convenient, too obvious. Someone wanted me to follow this trail, and that meant I was walking into whatever they had planned. The second sign came 3 miles later. Sarah's hiking boot, placed right in the middle of the trail where I couldn't miss it. Clean, undamaged, laces tied neat. If someone loses a boot in the wilderness, it's usually 'cause they're in serious trouble. Hypothermia, injury, panic. But this boot was placed there like a museum display. I tried my satellite phone to call David, but the mountains were blocking the signal. My GPS was still working, showing me exactly where I was, but that didn't tell me where Sarah was or who had taken her. All I could do was keep following the trail and hope I was good enough to handle whatever was waiting at the end. That's when the weather started turning on me. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees in an hour, and the wind picked up until it was howling through the trees like something alive and angry. Snow started falling, not the gentle kind, but the heavy, wet flakes that stick to everything and make the world disappear around you. My GPS started glitching, the screen flickering between readings that put me in 3 different locations. I should have known right then that this wasn't natural weather problems. Someone who knew these mountains, who'd planned this whole thing out, would know exactly how to interfere with electronic equipment, but I was so focused on finding Sarah that I didn't see the bigger picture yet. The trail led up into a narrow canyon where the walls rose 200 feet on both sides. Perfect place for an ambush, perfect place to control someone's movements. That's when my radio started crackling with interference, and through the static I heard something that made my blood go cold. "Mr. Valdez." The voice was calm, educated, with just a hint of a southern accent. "I've been waiting for you." I grabbed my radio. "Who is this? Where's Sarah Chen?" "Oh, she's safe for now. But whether she stays that way depends entirely on how well you play the game." That word, game, told me everything I needed to know about what I was dealing with. This wasn't some random psychopath or desperate criminal. This was someone who got off on the hunt, on the challenge. Someone who'd taken Sarah not just 'cause he could, but because he wanted to test himself against someone like me. "What do you want?" I asked, but I was already scanning the canyon walls, looking for movement, for the glint of sunlight on metal, for anything that might give away his position. "I want to see if you're as good as your reputation says you are. I've studied you, Mr. Valdez. 15 years with the Forest Service, dozens of successful rescues, that remarkable ability to find people when everyone else gives up. You're exactly what I've been looking for." The radio went dead, and that's when I realized I was in more trouble than I'd ever been in my life. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. I'd walked right into someone's twisted experiment, and now both our lives were on the line. I kept moving through the canyon, but now every shadow looked like a threat. Every sound could be an attack. My tracking abilities were still sharp, and I could see where Sarah had been walked through this area. Her prints mixed with larger boots, military-style treads that suggested someone with tactical training. But it was my human presence detection that was driving me crazy. I could feel him out there watching me, probably through a scope or binoculars. That constant sensation of being hunted, it wears on you in ways you can't imagine. Every step feels like it might be your last. Every decision could be the wrong one. The canyon opened up into a small meadow, and that's where I found the next message. Sarah's camera, the expensive Nikon she used for her National Geographic work, was hanging from a tree branch about 8 feet off the ground. Still in perfect condition, memory card still inside. But to get it, I'd have to expose myself in the open meadow for several minutes. That's when I understood what kind of mind I was dealing with. This wasn't just about psychological games. This was about behavioral analysis. He was testing my responses, seeing how I'd react under pressure, whether I'd take risks to gather information or play it safe and keep moving. I decided to take the risk. The camera might have pictures on it, evidence of who had taken Sarah or where they'd gone. But as I climbed that tree, exposed and vulnerable, I knew I was giving him exactly what he wanted. Data about how I made decisions under stress. The camera's memory card had over 200 photos on it, but only the last dozen mattered. Sarah had been photographing the mountain goats like she was supposed to, but in the background of several shots there was a figure in camouflage watching her through binoculars. The images were too distant to make out features, but the body language was clear. This was someone who'd been stalking her for hours before making his move. But the last photo on the card made my stomach drop. It was a close-up of Sarah's face taken from inches away. Her eyes were wide with terror, duct tape over her mouth, and behind her I could see the walls of what looked like a cave or mine shaft. She was alive when this was taken, but barely holding it together. Written on a piece of paper in the photo, in neat handwriting, was a message. She has approximately 36 hours before hypothermia becomes irreversible. The game continues north. Don't disappoint me. 36 hours. That gave me until Friday evening, and it was already Thursday afternoon. I was running out of time fast, and this bastard knew it. But worse than that, I was starting to realize that every move I'd made so far had been anticipated, planned for, studied. That's when everything started going to hell. My GPS unit finally gave up completely, the screen going black and staying that way. The storm was getting worse, visibility dropping to maybe 50 feet, and the temperature was plummeting toward zero. My radio was dead except for bursts of static, and my cell phone couldn't find a signal no matter where I tried it. But the worst part was that I was starting to lose confidence in my own abilities. Every skill I'd developed over 15 years, the tracking, the navigation, the survival instincts, all of it felt useless against someone who'd been 3 steps ahead of me from the beginning. I kept pushing north through the storm, but now I was navigating by instinct and memory alone. The trail I'd been following disappeared under 6 inches of snow, and without my GPS, I wasn't even sure I was heading in the right direction anymore. That's when I made my first real mistake. I was so focused on the immediate problem, finding shelter, staying warm, keeping moving, that I stopped paying attention to the bigger picture. I didn't notice that the terrain was funneling me toward a specific location, that every choice I made was actually the only logical choice given the circumstances. I walked right into his trap. The trail led into a narrow ravine where the walls were too steep to climb and too long to go around. About halfway through, I heard the sound of fallen rocks behind me, and turned to see that the entrance was blocked by a landslide. Fresh dirt, rocks still rolling. This had been triggered deliberately, probably by someone watching from above. I was trapped in a box canyon with walls too high to climb and only one way out. And that's when he finally showed himself. "Impressive work, Mr. Valdez." The voice came from somewhere above me, echoing off the rock wall so I couldn't pinpoint the location. "You've lasted longer than the previous 3. "Previous 3? I called out, but I was already moving, looking for cover, for any kind of defensive position. "Oh yes, you're not my first test subject, though you are by far the most interesting. Your reputation for finding people is quite deserved." That's when it hit me. The cold, horrible realization of what I was really dealing with. This wasn't just about Sarah Chen. This was about a predator who'd been hunting people like me, testing himself against search and rescue professionals, studying our methods so he could perfect his own techniques. "Dr. Marcus Webb," he said, and I could hear the pride in his voice. "Former Army psychologist, specialist in behavioral analysis under extreme stress. I spent 3 tours in Afghanistan studying how soldiers break down, how they adapt, how they overcome impossible odds. Fascinating work, really." I found a boulder that gave me some cover and tried to spot him on the canyon walls above. "What happened in Afghanistan, Webb? What broke you?" There was a long pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. Harder, more personal. "I wrote psychological evaluations for command decisions. Who was fit for duty? Who needed to be pulled back? Who could handle special operations? My analysis determined which soldiers lived and which ones died." The wind was howling through the canyon now, and I had to strain to hear him. "One of my evaluations was for Captain James Webb, my younger brother. I determined he was psychologically fit for a high-risk mission. He died 3 days later along with his entire squad because I misjudged his stress tolerance. Now I understood the motivation. This wasn't just about killing, this was about perfecting the science of human behavioral analysis. He was testing people like me to prove that his methods could predict exactly how someone would respond under extreme pressure. I've been refining my techniques for 3 years now," he continued. "Search and rescue professionals are ideal subjects because you're trained to overcome obstacles, to persist when others would give up. Your responses provide the most valuable data." That's when I realized Sarah Chen hadn't been chosen randomly either. "She photographed you, didn't she, during one of your previous experiments?" "Very good. Ms. Chen was in the area last month photographing wildlife when she inadvertently captured images of my work with subject number 2. She had to be eliminated, but her skill set made her perfect for attracting someone of your caliber." I felt sick. Sarah wasn't just a victim, she was bait, and I'd walked right into it like an amateur. "Now comes the interesting part," Webb said. "You have approximately 18 hours before hypothermia kills Miss Chen. I estimate it will take you 12 hours to navigate the obstacle course I've prepared, assuming you make optimal choices. That gives you a 6-hour margin for error." "Where is she?" "Follow the canyon north for 2 miles. You'll find additional instructions." "Oh, and Mr. Valdez? I'm genuinely curious to see how your psychological profile develops under increasing pressure. Try not to disappoint me." The canyon floor was covered with loose rock and hidden ice patches that made every step treacherous. But worse than the physical challenges was knowing that I was performing for an audience, that every decision I made was being analyzed and recorded. After an hour of climbing over rock falls and sliding down icy slopes, I found the next message. It was carved into the rock wall. "Choose. Left leads to Sarah in 8 hours, but 70% chance of avalanche. Right is safe, but 12 hours to destination. Hypothermia kills in 16 hours. This was what he wanted, to see how I'd balance risk against time pressure. Take the dangerous route and maybe save Sarah faster, or play it safe and probably watch her die. But I'd been in these mountains long enough to know something he didn't. I chose neither path. See, my spatial memory was finally kicking in despite all the stress and fear. I remembered this area from that search in 2007, and there was a third option he hadn't accounted for, an old mining tunnel that cut straight through the mountain. It was dangerous as hell, probably unstable, but it would get me to the other side in 4 hours instead of 8 or 12. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like I was gaining an advantage. Webb's psychological analysis was based on standard decision-making models, but he didn't know about my enhanced spatial memory or my ability to find paths that didn't exist on any map. I found the mine entrance exactly where I remembered it, hidden behind a stand of dead trees, barely visible even when you knew what to look for. The tunnel was dark, filled with stagnant air and the smell of old explosives, but it headed in the right direction. 3 hours later, I emerged on the north side of the mountain, and my radio suddenly crackled to life with Webb's voice. Impossible. That tunnel was sealed in 1987. You missed one, I said into the radio. Guess your research wasn't as thorough as you thought. Now I was ahead of his timeline, operating outside his psychological model. For the first time, I had him reacting to me instead of the other way around. But I also knew that made me more dangerous to him, and that put Sarah in even more immediate risk. The next marker led me to an abandoned ranger station that I remembered from my Forest Service days. It had been shut down in 2003, but the building was still solid, and that's where I found proof that Webb had been planning this for months. The interior was set up like a command center. Maps of Glacier National Park with trails marked, photos of me taken with a telephoto lens, detailed notes about my search and rescue techniques. But what really got my attention was a wall covered with information about his previous victims. 3 other search and rescue professionals, all lured into psychological experiments like this one. All of them had died, along with the people they'd been trying to save. Webb had been perfecting his methods, learning from each failure, until he felt ready to take on someone with my reputation. But there was also something he hadn't expected. A folder labeled contingency plans that he'd left open on the desk. Inside were detailed instructions for what to do if a subject deviated from predicted behavior patterns. And the primary contingency was simple: eliminate both subject and bait immediately. I was running out of time faster than I'd thought. I grabbed what equipment I could from the ranger station: a working flashlight, some emergency flares, and most importantly, an old avalanche beacon that still had battery power. If Webb was holding Sarah in a cave or mine shaft, the beacon might be able to detect the metal in her equipment or jewelry. The next 6 hours were the longest of my life. Webb's trail led higher into the mountains, above the tree line where the wind was strong enough to knock a man down and the cold was searing right through my layers. But my enhanced abilities were kicking in like never before. I could read the landscape like a story, seeing where Webb had tried to cover his tracks, where he'd made small mistakes because of fatigue or overconfidence. My sense of human presence was so sharp I could almost smell him in the air, following his psychological signature through the wilderness like a bloodhound. And that's when I realized something that changed everything. Webb was scared. His movements were getting more erratic, his attempts at concealment more desperate. He'd lost control of his experiment, and now he was improvising. That made him more dangerous in the short term, but it also meant he was making mistakes. The avalanche beacon started picking up a signal about midnight, led me toward an old copper mine that was marked as condemned on my maps. The signal got stronger as I approached, and I knew I'd found where he was keeping Sarah. But I also knew this was where Webb would make his final stand. The mine entrance was partially collapsed, but there was a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I could hear voices echoing from deep inside, Webb talking to someone, though I couldn't make out the words. I left most of my equipment outside and squeezed through the opening with just my flashlight and one of the emergency flares. The tunnel sloped downward for about 50 feet before opening into a larger chamber, and that's where I found them. Sarah Chen was tied to a support beam, alive but barely conscious from hypothermia. Webb was standing over her with a pistol in one hand and what looked like a digital recorder in the other. When my flashlight beam hit him, I finally got a good look at the man who'd been hunting me for days. He was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 5'8", with thinning brown hair and the kind of wire-rimmed glasses you'd see on a college professor. But his eyes were what got my attention. Cold, analytical, completely without empathy. This was someone who saw other people as test subjects, not human beings. "Mr. Valdez," he said, and he actually smiled. 16 hours, 43 minutes. Remarkable time, considering the obstacles. You've exceeded every psychological model I've developed. Let her go, Webb. Your experiment's over. Oh no, it's just beginning. You see, the real test wasn't whether you could find her. It was how you'd respond when forced to choose between your own survival and hers. And that's when I noticed the wires running from Webb's position to various points around the chamber. Explosives, probably enough to bring down the whole mine shaft. He'd rigged the place to collapse and he was holding the detonator. "The tunnel you entered through is the only way out," he said. "These charges will seal it permanently. You can save yourself by leaving now, or you can stay and die with Ms. Chen. Either choice provides valuable data about altruistic behavior under extreme stress." But Webb had made one crucial error in his analysis. He'd underestimated how much I'd learned from my previous traumatic experiences. Losing my partner in '08 had taught me something about surviving when everything goes wrong. Nearly dying of hypothermia in '09 had shown me how far I could push my body past its normal limits. And every family I'd helped, every desperate parent or spouse I'd reunited with their loved ones, had given me something Webb couldn't measure or predict. A reason to keep fighting when logic said to give up. I popped the emergency flare and threw it as hard as I could at the explosives rigged to the tunnel entrance. Webb spun toward the sudden red light, and that gave me the split second I needed to tackle him before he could trigger the main charges. We went down hard on the rocky floor and the gun skittered away into the darkness. Webb was smaller than me, but he fought like a man with nothing to lose, clawing at my eyes and trying to reach something in his jacket pocket, probably a backup detonator. But 3 years of private search and rescue work had kept me in better shape than his academic lifestyle had kept him. I pinned his arms and put enough pressure on his throat to make him stop struggling. "Where's the detonator?" I demanded. He actually laughed, blood running from his nose where I'd hit him. "You think this is over? I've been broadcasting everything on digital radio. My research will continue with or without me." That's when I heard it. Voices echoing from outside the mine. Rescue teams, probably guided by the GPS coordinates I'd programmed into my equipment before it failed. David Chen's voice calling his wife's name. Webb's expression changed when he heard those voices. For the first time, he looked genuinely surprised. "Impossible, no one knew where you'd gone." "That's where you made your biggest mistake," I told him. "You studied me as an individual, but you didn't account for the people who care about me. I've got friends in search and rescue all over Montana, and when I didn't check in yesterday, they started tracking my last known position." The voices were getting closer, and Webb was starting to panic. He reached for something in his jacket again, but I grabbed his wrist and twisted until he cried out. "It's over," I said. "Sarah's alive, you're caught, and your sick experiment ends here." But Webb had one more surprise. He started laughing again. Harder this time. "You still don't understand, do you? Sarah Chen was never the real target." My blood went cold. "What are you talking about?" "The real experiment was about you. How long would it take to break down Tony Valdez's psychological defenses? How far could I push you before you snapped? Sarah was just the catalyst." That's when I heard David Chen's voice much closer, maybe 20 feet from the mine entrance. "Sarah! Sarah, can you hear me?" And Webb smiled that cold, analytical smile one more time. "The real Sarah Chen is safe at home in Seattle. That woman you've been trying to save? She's Jennifer Walsh, an actress I hired to play the part. The desperate phone calls, the tearful family members, and all of it was carefully orchestrated to manipulate your emotional responses." I stared at him, feeling like the ground was shifting under my feet. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Look at her again, Mr. Valdez. Really look." I turned my flashlight toward the woman tied to the support beam, and for the first time, I saw what I'd missed in all the stress and urgency. The face was similar, but the bone structure was wrong. The height was close, but the hair color was slightly off. This wasn't the woman from the photos David Chen had shown me. 3 years of preparation, Webb said. Months of psychological profiling. I studied every case you'd worked, every family you'd helped. I knew exactly which emotional triggers would motivate you to take incredible risks. The voices outside were closer now, and I could hear equipment being moved around. The real rescue team was preparing to enter the mine, and they had no idea they were walking into the final stage of a madman's experiment. "Jennifer's been unconscious for hours," Webb continued. "Severe hypothermia, probably irreversible brain damage by now. But don't worry. Her death will provide excellent data about your psychological response to failure." That's when something inside me just snapped. All the fear, all the stress, all the manipulation, it crystallized into pure rage. I'd been played from the beginning, manipulated like a lab rat, and now an innocent woman was dying because of my arrogance. I grabbed Webb by the jacket and slammed him against the mine wall hard enough to knock the wind out of him. "Where's the real Sarah Chen?" "Home, with her family, in Seattle," he gasped. "Never was here." I hit him again, harder this time. "And Jennifer Walsh? How long has she been unconscious?" "Since this morning. Hypothermia. Takes time." I left Webb slumped against the wall and went to check on Jennifer. Her pulse was barely detectable, her breathing shallow, skin gray with cold. She was alive, but barely, and she needed medical attention immediately. "Help!" I yelled toward the mine entrance. "I need a medical team in here now." Within minutes, the chamber was full of rescue workers and paramedics. They got Jennifer stabilized and started warming her up while the sheriff's deputies took Webb into custody. But even as they worked, I could see in their faces that they weren't sure she was going to make it. David Chen was there too, and when he saw Jennifer Walsh instead of his wife, the relief and confusion on his face was almost too much to watch. "I don't understand," he kept saying. "Where's Sarah? Where's my wife?" That's when I had to explain the hardest truth I'd ever told a family member. His wife had never been in danger. The desperate phone calls, the missing person report, the whole elaborate setup. It had all been fabricated to manipulate me into Webb's psychological experiment. But the real Sarah Chen was safe. She was home in Seattle, had never been to Glacier National Park, had no idea that her identity had been stolen for this sick game. Webb had used publicly available information, her National Geographic work, photos from her website, personal details from social media, to create a fictional scenario that would hook me emotionally. Jennifer Walsh survived, though she spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from severe hypothermia and frostbite. She'd been hired through a fake casting call for what she thought was an independent film about survival in the wilderness. She had no idea she was being used as bait in a psychological experiment until it was too late. Webb was convicted of kidnapping, attempted murder, and about a dozen other charges. During his trial, they found evidence of his 3 previous experiments, all of them successful from his perspective, meaning both the search and rescue professional and their target had died. I was supposed to be his masterpiece, the final proof that his behavioral analysis techniques were flawless, but he made one critical error in his psychological profile of me. He assumed I was motivated purely by professional pride and the challenge of a difficult search. He didn't account for the fact that 15 years of rescuing people had fundamentally changed who I was as a person. The trauma I'd experienced, the losses I'd endured, the families I'd helped, all of it had created emotional bonds that went beyond any psychological model. When I thought I was saving Sarah Chen, I wasn't just doing my job. I was honoring every family that had trusted me with their most precious thing, and that gave me strength Webb couldn't measure or predict. I still do search and rescue work, though I'm a lot more careful about verifying information before I head into the wilderness. And sometimes late at night, I think about how close I came to being just another data point in a madman's research. But I also think about Jennifer Walsh and how she beat the odds to survive. I think about the real Sarah Chen, safe at home with her family. And I think about all the families I've helped over the years, all the people who are alive today because someone refused to give up on them. That's worth all the trauma, all the fear, all the manipulation. Because in the end, Webb was wrong about human nature. We're not just test subjects reacting to stimuli. We're capable of love, sacrifice, and incredible courage when it matters most. And that's something no amount of psychological analysis can ever really understand. Because when you strip away all the science and theory, what remains is simple. Sometimes people need help, and sometimes there's someone willing to risk everything to provide it. That's not data to be analyzed. That's what makes us human. And I'm damn proud to be part of that. My name is Kyle Henderson, and I'm gonna tell you about the worst damn day of my life. Hell, calling it a day doesn't do it justice. It was more like 3 days that changed everything I thought I knew about what people are capable of doing to each other. Look, I was 28 back in 2008. Been working as a forest ranger for about 6 years up in Yellowstone. Had a decent reputation for finding folks who got themselves lost or hurt out there in the wilderness. People said I had a gift for it, but I always figured it was just paying attention to details others missed. You know, reading the signs nature leaves behind, understanding how people think when they're scared and alone. That October was brutal cold, way colder than usual for the season. The financial crisis had everybody on edge. Hell, even the Park Service was talking layoffs. But that morning, October 23rd, I woke up thinking it'd be just another routine day. Got my gear ready like always. GPS unit, digital camera, first aid kit, extra batteries, my old Motorola flip phone that barely got signal up in the backcountry. I was just finishing my coffee when the call came in. Dispatch patched through this frantic woman, and I could hear right away that this wasn't gonna be your typical missing hiker case. "Please," she's saying, and her voice is breaking every few words. "My daughter Sarah. She's been missing for 3 days now. 3 days." The desperation in that woman's voice hit me like a punch to the gut. You gotta understand, I'd taken hundreds of these calls over the years, but something about the way she said her daughter's name, like she was holding on to it for dear life, that got to me right away. The woman was Dr. Lisa Chen, and she was calling from the Sacramento airport with her husband. They were flying out to Wyoming that morning, couldn't wait another minute. Their daughter Sarah was 24, a grad student at UC Davis doing research on wolfpack behavior patterns. Smart kid apparently, real smart. She'd been camping alone up in the Lamar Valley for her thesis work, had all the proper permits and equipment, but she'd missed her scheduled radio check-in 3 days ago, and now her GPS locator beacon had gone silent. "She knows what she's doing out there," Dr. Chen kept saying, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. "Sarah's been camping since she was 10. She wouldn't just disappear." But here's the thing. I'd heard that same desperate logic from families before. The truth is, the wilderness doesn't care how experienced you are. It'll kill you just as quick whether you've been camping for 20 years or 20 minutes. After I got off the phone with her mother, I called the park dispatch and got the full details. Sarah Chen, 5'4", black hair, last seen wearing a red North Face jacket. She'd been radio silent since 6 p.m. on October 20th. Her research campsite was about 8 miles northeast of the Lamar Valley Road, up in some pretty remote country where the cell towers couldn't reach. Now, I'd been up in that area plenty of times. It's beautiful country, but it's also unforgiving as hell, especially in late October when the weather can turn deadly without warning. We'd already had 2 snow dustings that week, and the forecast was calling for a major storm system to move through in the next 48 hours. I loaded up my truck and headed out around 9 a.m., taking the back roads through the park. The aspens were already bare, their white trunks looking like bone against the gray sky. There was something about the whole scene that felt wrong, you know? Like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something bad to happen. About an hour into the drive, my phone starts buzzing. It's Dr. Chen again, calling from the plane. "Any news?" she asks, and I can hear engines in the background, that hollow sound of airplane cabin. "I'm heading to her last known location now," I told her. "Should be there within the hour." Her brother Alex, he wanted to fly out too, but we made him stay in school. God, what if she's... Her voice just breaks apart, and I hear her husband taking the phone. "This is James Chen," he says, and his voice is steadier, but you can hear the fear underneath. "Officer Henderson, Sarah is everything to us. Everything. Whatever resources you need, whatever it costs, we'll pay it." That's when I knew this family was going to haunt me until I brought their daughter home. And I mean brought her home alive, because anything else wasn't going to be acceptable. I reached Sarah's campsite around 10:30 a.m. and right away I could see something was off. Now I've got this ability. I guess you'd call it exceptional tracking. I can spot details that most people walk right past. Disturbed earth, broken vegetation, scuff marks on rocks, stuff that tells a story if you know how to read it. Sarah's tent was still standing, guy lines properly tensioned, no obvious damage. Her food was stored correctly in a bear canister, and her campfire ring showed signs of recent use. But here's what bothered me. Her sleeping bag was laid out neat as a hotel bed. No one sleeps that neat when they're camping alone for research. It looked staged. I started walking the perimeter of her campsite, and that's when I found the first real clue. About 30 feet from her tent, there was a partial boot print in the soft earth near a fallen log, size 11 or 12, deep tread pattern that looked like military-style boots. The print was facing toward her campsite, like someone had been watching from the tree line. Now that could have been anything. Park ranger patrol, another camper, hell, maybe even Sarah's own boots from a few days ago. But something about the positioning bothered me. The person who made that print had been standing there for a while, long enough to shift their weight and leave multiple impressions. They'd been watching. I took pictures with my digital camera, marking the GPS coordinates in my notebook. Then I started expanding my search pattern, moving out in wider circles from her campsite. That's when I found her first personal item. About 50 yards downstream from her tent, caught in some willows along the creek bank, I found one of Sarah's wool socks. Just one sock, like it had been pulled off in a hurry. The wool was still clean, no significant wear or tearing, which meant it hadn't been in the water long. My phone buzzed again. Doctor, Chen calling from the Denver airport during their layover. Please tell me you found something, she says. And I can hear people talking in the background, the chaos of a busy airport. I'm at her campsite now, I told her. Her tent and equipment are intact. I'm following a trail downstream. Do you think she's okay? What was I supposed to say? That I'd found evidence someone had been watching her campsite? That one of her socks was hanging in the bushes like some kind of marker? Instead, I said, I'm still gathering information, ma'am. I'll call you as soon as I know more. But the truth was, I was starting to get a real bad feeling about this whole situation. I kept following the creek downstream, and that's when my nature reading ability kicked into high gear. See, I've always been able to interpret animal behavior, and what I was seeing didn't make sense. The ravens that should have been calling to each other were silent. A pair of elk tracks showed they'd changed direction suddenly, like they'd been spooked by something and decided to get the hell out of the area. About a quarter-mile from Sarah's campsite, I found her research notebook. It was sitting on a flat rock right next to the creek, positioned so perfectly that you couldn't miss it if you were following the water downstream. The pages were still dry despite being outside for 3 days, which meant someone had placed it there recently, maybe even that morning. I opened the notebook carefully, not wanting to damage any potential evidence. Sarah's handwriting was neat and precise, filled with observations about wolf pack movements and feeding patterns. But the last entry, dated October 20th at 5:47 p.m., just stopped mid-sentence. The alpha male's behavior suggests territorial stress, possibly due to... And then nothing. Not even a pen mark trailing off. Just blank pages after that, like she'd been interrupted while writing. That's when I heard it. A sound that made every hair on my neck stand up. It was a whistle, long and low, coming from somewhere upstream. Now, I'd been in these mountains long enough to know every natural sound they make, and this wasn't natural. This was human, deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I looked around, scanning the tree line on both sides of the creek. The whistle came again, definitely from upstream, back toward Sarah's campsite. My first instinct was to call out. Maybe it was Sarah herself, hurt and trying to signal for help. But something held me back. Call it ranger instinct, call it paranoia, but something felt wrong about the whole setup. Instead of heading toward the whistle, I used my spatial memory, another one of my abilities, to navigate around through the timber, approaching the sound source from a different angle. I'd been through this area enough times that I could move through the trees without making noise, staying downwind and out of sight. What I found changed everything. There was a man standing about 100 yards upstream from Sarah's campsite. Tall, maybe 6'2", wearing military-style clothing and those same boots that had made the print I'd found earlier. He had gray hair, neatly trimmed, and was holding a small digital recorder up to his mouth. He was making the whistling sound into the recorder, playing it back, then making notes in a small notebook, like he was conducting some kind of experiment. I stayed hidden behind a large pine tree watching him work. The guy moved with purpose, methodical and calm, like he'd done this before. He'd make a sound into the recorder, play it back, then walk to a different position and try again. He was testing how the sounds carried through the forest, mapping out the acoustics. That's when it hit me. This wasn't some random encounter. This guy had been studying the area, learning how to manipulate sounds and sightlines. He'd placed Sarah's notebook where I'd find it, probably moved her sock too. He was leading me around like a dog on a leash. I needed to get back to my truck and radio for backup, but as I started to move away, the man suddenly turned and looked directly at where I was hiding. Even from 100 yards away, I could see him smile. Then he raised his hand and gave me a little wave. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, and that's when I knew Sarah Chen wasn't just missing. She'd been taken by someone who was smart, organized, and had been planning this for a while. The man picked up a large backpack from the ground and started walking away, not hurrying, just moving with that same methodical pace. Before he disappeared into the timber, he turned around one more time and pointed downstream like he was giving me directions. I waited until he was completely out of sight, then made my way back to my truck as fast as I could move quietly through the forest. My hands were shaking as I tried to get my radio working, but all I got was static. We were too far from the repeater towers, and my cell phone showed no signal bars. I had two choices: drive back toward civilization to get help, or follow the direction the man had pointed and see where this trail led. Every instinct I had was screaming to get back up, but then I thought about Dr. Chen's voice on the phone, the way she'd said her daughter's name like it was the most precious thing in the world. If Sarah was still alive, she might not stay that way much longer. I grabbed my pack, checked my GPS coordinates, and started following the creek downstream again. But this time, I knew I wasn't tracking a lost hiker. I was hunting a predator, and that predator knew I was coming. The next 2 hours were like walking through a chess game where I could only see half the board. Every 50 yards or so, I'd find another piece of evidence. Sarah's hair tie wrapped around a branch, a partial footprint in the mud, scratch marks on tree bark that looked deliberate. The guy was leaving me a trail, but he was also studying how I moved, how I thought, what I paid attention to. Around 2 p.m., my phone got enough signal for Dr. Chen's call to come through. "Kyle?" Her voice was desperate now, raw from crying. "We just landed in Jackson. We're driving up to the park now. Please tell me you found her." "Ma'am, I need you to listen to me carefully," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sarah didn't just get lost. Someone took her. I've contacted Park Dispatch for backup, and we're treating this as an active kidnapping situation." The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard Dr. Chen start sobbing, and her husband took the phone. "What do you mean someone took her?" Dr. Chen's father demanded. "Who would take her? She's just a graduate student doing research." "I don't know who or why yet," I told him, "but I'm following a trail. I'm gonna find her." "How long?" His voice cracked. "How long has she been missing? Really?" The truth was, if someone had taken Sarah 3 days ago, she was either already dead or being kept alive for a specific reason. And I was starting to suspect that reason had something to do with me. As I hung up the phone, I found another marker: Sarah's red North Face jacket tied to a tree branch about 8 feet off the ground. Too high for her to have hung it there herself, and positioned so it was visible from a long distance. This guy wanted me to see it, wanted me to know he had her. But what bothered me most was how pristine the jacket looked. No tears, no blood, no signs of struggle. It was like Sarah had just taken it off and handed it to someone. That's when I heard the voice calling my name. "Kyle! Kyle Henderson!" It was coming from deeper in the forest, maybe a quarter mile ahead. A woman's voice, definitely not Sarah based on the recordings I'd heard of her voice from the family. This voice was older, rougher, like someone who'd been smoking for years. Every instinct I had told me it was a trap, but what if it wasn't? What if someone else had seen Sarah or knew where she was? I couldn't ignore it. I followed the voice deeper into the timber, and that's when everything went to hell. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in about 10 minutes, and dark clouds started rolling in from the northwest. My GPS unit started acting up, showing my location jumping around like I was teleporting through the forest. Then my digital camera died completely, even though I'd put fresh batteries in that morning. The voice kept calling my name, always staying about the same distance ahead, leading me farther and farther away from any marked trails. I was using my natural orientation ability to keep track of where I was, but even that was getting harder as the weather deteriorated. Then my radio went completely silent. Not static, just dead air, like someone had turned off every repeater tower in the state. I was about 4 miles from my truck following a game trail through thick timber when I stepped wrong on a loose rock and felt something in my ankle give way. The pain shot up my leg like electricity, and when I tried to put weight on it, my whole leg just buckled. I sat down hard on a fallen log and pulled off my boot to check the damage. My ankle was already starting to swell, and when I tried to flex it, the pain was so intense I nearly blacked out. Sprained at minimum, maybe broken. That's when I heard laughing. Not Sarah's voice this time, or that older woman who'd been calling my name. This was a man's laugh, low and satisfied, like he'd just watched his favorite movie scene. "Very good, Kyle," the voice said from somewhere in the trees around me. "You followed the trail exactly as I predicted. Methodical, careful, but ultimately predictable." I looked around, trying to spot him, but the voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. The guy was using the forest acoustics, bouncing his voice off trees so I couldn't pinpoint his location. "Where's Sarah?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady despite the pain in my ankle. "Sarah is safe for now. She's an excellent subject, very resilient. But she's not why we're here, Kyle. This is about you." "Me? What the hell are you talking about?" "I've been studying you for months, Kyle Henderson. Reading your case files, understanding your methods. You have remarkable abilities. Truly remarkable. I wanted to see them in action." The voice was closer now, maybe 30 feet away, but I still couldn't see him through the thick timber. "Who are you?" I demanded. "Dr. Marcus Webb, formerly of the University of Colorado Psychology Department, currently pursuing independent research into human survival responses under extreme stress." Dr. Marcus Webb. I'd never heard the name before, but the way he said formerly told me there was a story there. "What happened to your job, Doc?" "Academic politics," he said, and I could hear the bitterness in his voice. "My research into breaking points was deemed unethical by small-minded people who couldn't appreciate the broader implications. They destroyed my career, my family, everything I'd worked for. So now I conduct my studies in a more practical environment, by kidnapping innocent people, by creating controlled scenarios that reveal the true nature of human responses. Sarah was selected because she represented the perfect combination of intelligence, isolation, and connection to family. Her disappearance would attract someone with your particular skill set." That's when it hit me. I wasn't just trying to rescue Sarah Chen. I was the real subject of this psychopath's experiment. Sarah was just the bait. "You want to study me breaking down? You want to see what happens when I can't save her?" "Exactly. And so far, your responses have been fascinating. The way you read environmental clues, your ability to track through difficult terrain, your persistence despite obvious danger. But now comes the interesting part." A cold rain started falling, turning quickly to sleet. My ankle was throbbing, my equipment was failing, and I was miles from help with a storm moving in. If this Dr. Webb character wanted to see me break, he'd created the perfect conditions for it. "Here's what's going to happen, Kyle. Sarah is in a location that will become lethal when the storm hits. You have until sunset to find her, approximately 4 hours given the cloud cover, but I've taken steps to ensure your usual advantages won't be available." As if on cue, my GPS unit started beeping with a low battery warning, then went completely dead. "Your technology will fail you. Your radio doesn't work. Your truck is miles away, and with that ankle, you're not walking out of here. This comes down to your raw abilities against my psychological warfare. And if I find her, then you both live. I'll disappear, and you can have your happy reunion with the Chen family. But Kyle," his voice took on an almost gentle tone, "I don't think you're going to find her. I think you're going to die out here, cold and lost, knowing that Sarah died because you weren't good enough." The voice went silent, leaving me alone with the sound of sleet hitting the forest canopy and the throbbing pain in my ankle. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, feeling sorry for myself and thinking about how everything had gone wrong. My equipment was shot, I was injured, the weather was turning deadly, and some psycho professor was playing mind games with an innocent woman's life. Then I thought about Dr. Chen's voice on the phone, the way she'd broken down when I told her Sarah had been taken. I thought about her father, flying across the country to find his daughter. I thought about Sarah herself, 24 years old, smart enough to be doing graduate research, probably scared out of her mind right now, but still hoping someone would come for her. That's when something clicked in me, something I'd never felt before. All those years as a ranger, all those successful rescues, all the times I'd used my abilities to find lost hikers, that was nothing compared to what I felt right then. This wasn't just about doing my job anymore. This was personal. I stood up, putting weight on my good leg, and started really looking at my situation. Yeah, my ankle was screwed up, but I could still move. Yeah, my GPS was dead, but I'd been navigating these mountains long before GPS existed. Yeah, the weather was getting nasty, but I'd been through worse storms. And Dr. Webb had made one crucial mistake. He'd told me Sarah was in a location that would become lethal when the storm hit. That gave me a huge clue about where to look. I started thinking about the terrain I'd covered, the areas where someone could be hidden but vulnerable to weather. Caves were too stable, thick timber would provide shelter, but there were a few spots in this area where someone could be trapped and exposed. Old mining shafts, rock shelters that faced the wrong direction, places where hypothermia would set in fast once the temperature really dropped. My tracking ability went into overdrive, but different than before. Instead of just looking for physical evidence, I started reading the landscape like a map of possibilities. Where would someone hide a captive? Where could you keep them secure but not permanently protected? The answer came to me like a flash of insight. The old ranger cabin about 2 miles northeast. It had been abandoned for years, officially condemned due to structural damage, but it was still standing. More importantly, it had a root cellar underneath, accessible through an outside entrance. Someone could be kept there, secure but vulnerable if the temperature dropped below freezing. I started moving, ignoring the pain in my ankle and using my spatial memory to navigate through timber I'd patrolled dozens of times over the years. The sleet was getting heavier, and I could feel the temperature continuing to drop. But for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt like I had a real direction. My natural orientation ability was working better than it ever had before. Like the stress and adrenaline had enhanced it somehow. I could feel the magnetic pull of true north, sense the lay of the land even through the storm clouds. Every step felt deliberate, purposeful, like I was following an invisible trail towards Sarah's location. About a mile into the hike, I found more evidence. Not left by Dr. Webb this time, but real clues I was reading from the environment. A broken branch at exactly the right height for someone carrying something heavy. Disturbed earth where someone had slipped on wet ground. Fresh scratches on tree bark where someone had used the trees for support. Dr. Webb was smart, but he wasn't a wilderness expert. He'd made small mistakes, left tiny signs that someone with my abilities could read. He was counting on technology and psychology, but he didn't understand that some skills go deeper than equipment. The old cabin came into view just as the sleet turned to snow. The structure looked even more dilapidated than I remembered, with boards missing from the walls and part of the roof collapsed. But the foundation was solid, and I could see that the root cellar entrance on the north side had been recently disturbed. I approached carefully, listening for any sounds from inside. The wind was picking up, making the old building creak and groan. But underneath the weather noise, I could hear something else, a rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood in a pattern. 3 quick taps, pause, 3 more taps. It was coming from underground, from the root cellar. I made my way to the cellar entrance, a heavy wooden door set at an angle into the hillside. The door had a new padlock on it, but the wood around the hinges was rotted. A few solid kicks with my good leg, and the whole thing came apart. The cellar was dark and cold, but I could hear movement inside. I called out, "Sarah? Sarah Chen?" "Oh my God," came a woman's voice from the darkness. "Please help me. I'm down here." I used the LED light on my keyring to see into the cellar. Sarah was there, alive but tied to a support post with climbing rope. She looked cold and scared but uninjured. Her dark hair was matted and she was wearing just jeans and a sweater. They'd taken her jacket to use as a marker on the trail. "It's okay," I told her, climbing down into the cellar despite my ankle. "I'm Kyle Henderson, park ranger. Your parents sent me to find you." She started crying when I said that, not from fear but from relief. I knew they'd send someone. I knew they wouldn't give up. I was working on the ropes that held her when I heard footsteps above us. Heavy boots on the cabin floor moving slowly and deliberately. "Very impressive, Kyle." Dr. Webb's voice called down through the cellar entrance. "You found her in under 3 hours. Much faster than my projections indicated. I helped Sarah to her feet and she could walk okay, just stiff from being tied up for 3 days." "Now what, Doc?" I called up to him. "You said if I found her, we both live." I did say that, didn't I? There was amusement in his voice. "But you see, Kyle, the experiment isn't over. The final test is whether you can get her out of there before you both freeze to death." That's when I heard the sound of wood being dragged across the ground. He was covering the cellar entrance, trapping us inside. The temperature in the cellar was already below 40 degrees, and with the entrance blocked, it would drop fast. We had maybe an hour before hypothermia became a serious threat, less if we couldn't find a way to generate heat. I looked around the cellar with my key light. Stone walls, dirt floor, some old canning shelves along one wall, but at the far end I could see what looked like another opening, maybe a tunnel that connected to the cabin's original foundation. "Sarah, I need you to tell me everything that happened. How long you've been here, what he said to you, anything that might help us get out." She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the cold. "He grabbed me at my campsite 3 nights ago, used some kind of spray that made me dizzy, and when I woke up, I was here. He kept asking me questions about my family, about who would come looking for me." "What kind of questions?" "Specific things, like whether my parents would hire private investigators, or if they'd trust the Park Service to handle it. He wanted to know if I had any connection to law enforcement." Dr. Webb had been researching the Chen family, learning their psychological profile so he could predict their responses. He'd wanted someone whose disappearance would attract a specific type of rescuer, someone with my particular abilities. I made my way to the tunnel opening at the back of the cellar. It was narrow, maybe 3 feet high, but it seemed to extend back under the cabin. Cold air was moving through it, which meant it connected to the outside somewhere. "Can you crawl?" I asked Sarah. "I think so. Why?" "Because that tunnel might be our way out. But I need to go first. Make sure it's safe." The crawl through the tunnel was hell on my injured ankle, but after about 20 feet I could see light ahead. The tunnel opened into what had been the cabin's original basement, and from there, a set of stone steps led up to a door that opened directly outside. Dr. Webb had made another mistake. He'd blocked the main cellar entrance but didn't know about the secondary escape route. I went back for Sarah, and we made our way through the tunnel together. When we emerged outside the cabin, the snow was falling heavily, but we were free. That's when Dr. Webb stepped out from behind a tree, maybe 50 feet away. He was holding what looked like a hunting rifle, pointed in our general direction but not directly at us. "Remarkable," he said, and he sounded genuinely pleased. "You found the secondary exit. I didn't even know that existed." "It's over, Doc. We're out, we're alive, and backup is going to be here soon." He shook his head. "I'm afraid backup isn't coming, Kyle. I've been monitoring Park Service radio frequencies. They think you're still following standard search protocols. They have no idea this has become a kidnapping situation." He was probably right. I'd been out of radio contact for hours, and my failure to check in might not seem unusual given the weather conditions. "But you're correct about one thing," Dr. Webb continued. "The primary experiment is complete. You've demonstrated remarkable abilities under extreme stress. Sarah is alive and unharmed. By the terms of our agreement, you should both be allowed to leave." "Should be?" "Well, there is the matter of my legal exposure. You've seen my face, heard my name. Sarah can identify me. From a practical standpoint, allowing you to leave creates certain complications. That's when I realized Dr. Webb had never intended to let us go. The whole agreement had been part of the psychological manipulation, giving me hope so he could study how I performed under pressure. Sarah moved closer to me, and I could feel her shaking from cold and fear. "You want to see what I'm really capable of?" I asked him. I thought I already had. "No, Doc. You've seen me track and navigate and solve problems, but you haven't seen what happens when someone threatens an innocent person in front of me." Doctor Webb raised the rifle, not quite aiming at us, but making his threat clear. "I'm sorry, Kyle. You've been an excellent subject, but this is where the study ends." That's when my human presence detection ability kicked in stronger than it ever had before. I could sense exactly where he was going to move, could read his body language like a book. The guy was nervous, uncertain, not nearly as in control as he wanted us to believe. More importantly, I realized something about the rifle he was holding. The way he carried it, the way he held it. He wasn't comfortable with the weapon. Dr. Webb was an academic, not a shooter. He probably had basic familiarity with the rifle, but no real skill or confidence. "Sarah," I said quietly, not taking my eyes off Dr. Webb. "When I move, you run toward those trees behind us. Don't look back. Just keep running until you hit the main trail." "What are you going to do?" "Something stupid, probably." Dr. Webb had made his final mistake. He'd gotten too close, maybe 30 feet away. Close enough that someone with my spatial awareness could cover the distance before he could aim and fire accurately. I took off running straight at him, ignoring the pain in my ankle. Using every bit of natural orientation and environmental reading ability I had to stay upright on the slippery ground. Dr. Webb raised the rifle and fired, but he rushed the shot, and the bullet went wide. Before he could work the bolt action for a second shot, I was on him. The tackle took us both down hard, and the rifle went flying into the snow. Dr. Webb was bigger than me, but he was soft, academic muscle versus the practical strength I'd built up from 6 years of wilderness work. The fight didn't last long. A few solid punches and Dr. Webb was done, lying in the snow with blood coming from his nose and looking up at me with what might have been respect. "Truly remarkable," he said, spitting blood. "Your abilities under stress are even more impressive than I theorized." "Shut up," I told him, using his belt to tie his hands behind his back. "Sarah, you can come back now, it's over." She emerged from the trees, still shaking but alive and free. "Is he?" "He's alive. Probably wishes he wasn't, but alive." By the time Park Service backup arrived, I'd managed to get my radio working once we were out of the heavy timber. Dr. Webb was secured and hypothermic, but conscious. Sarah was wrapped in blankets and asking to call her parents. The whole story came out over the next few hours. Dr. Marcus Webb, former psychology professor, had lost his position at University of Colorado after conducting unauthorized experiments on graduate students. His wife had left him, taking their kids, and he'd lost his house in the resulting legal settlements. He'd been living in the wilderness for almost a year, developing his field research methods. Sarah was his third victim. He'd killed 2 hikers in Colorado before moving to Wyoming. The FBI found evidence of his other crimes when they searched his camp. But here's the thing that stayed with me, the thing that changed everything about how I saw my abilities and my purpose. Sarah Chen survived because her family never gave up hope, and because I learned something about myself that I'd never known before. When everything went wrong, when my equipment failed, when I got hurt, when the weather turned deadly, my abilities didn't disappear. They got stronger. Like all that trauma and pressure had unlocked something deeper than just tracking skills or navigation sense. I could read environments and situations and people at a level I'd never experienced before. It was like Dr. Webb's experiment had accidentally created the exact opposite of what he'd intended. Instead of breaking me down, the extreme stress had made me better at everything I was already good at. When the Chen family arrived at the hospital that night, Sarah was being kept overnight for observation. Seeing their reunion was worth every minute of pain and fear I'd gone through. Dr. Lisa Chen grabbed my hands and couldn't stop thanking me, and her husband kept saying, "You brought our daughter home. You brought our daughter home." But it was Sarah herself who said something that stuck with me. As I was getting ready to leave the hospital, she pulled me aside and said, "Kyle, that man wanted to know what would break you. I think what he found out was that some people can't be broken. Some people just get stronger." Looking back now, that October day in 2008 was when I first realized that my abilities weren't just useful for finding lost hikers. They were something more, something that could make a real difference when everything else failed. Dr. Webb got life in prison without parole for the Colorado murders. During his sentencing, he asked to make a statement, and what he said was probably the closest thing to a compliment I've ever received from a complete psychopath. "Kyle Henderson," he said, looking directly at me from the defendant's table, "represents a fascinating example of human potential under extreme stress. My research may have been deemed unethical, but it did prove one thing. Some individuals possess abilities that emerge only when facing impossible circumstances. Mr. Henderson is such an individual." I didn't thank him for the observation, but I never forgot it either, because 3 months later I got another call about a missing person case that turned out to be way more complicated than anyone expected. And that's when I really started to understand what Dr. Webb had accidentally taught me about my own capabilities. The thing is, once you've survived something like what happened in Yellowstone, once you've seen what people are capable of doing to each other and discovered what you're capable of doing to stop them, you can't just go back to routine lost hiker cases. That's why I'm telling you this story. Because Sarah Chen wasn't just a victim who got rescued. She was the first person I saved using abilities I didn't even know I had. And her case taught me that sometimes the worst experiences in your life can reveal the best parts of who you really are. The Chens still send me Christmas cards every year, with pictures of Sarah at graduate school, then at her wedding, then with her first kid. She's Dr. Sarah Chen Martinez now, professor of wildlife biology at UC Davis, and every December I get a reminder that some stories really do have happy endings. But I also know that Dr. Webb was right about one thing. Extreme circumstances do reveal who people really are. Some people break, some people run, and some people discover they're capable of things they never imagined. I found out I was the third type, and that knowledge has shaped every case I've worked since 2008. 'Cause now I know that when everything goes to hell, when all the equipment fails and the weather turns deadly and some psychopath is playing mind games with innocent people's lives, that's not when my abilities get weaker. That's when they get stronger. And that's a lesson that's saved more lives than I can count in the years since Sarah Chen. My name is Alex Turner, and I'm going to tell you about the worst damn day of my life. Well, maybe not the worst. I've had a few that could compete for that title. But this one, hell, this one changed everything I thought I knew about the kind of evil that walks around in human skin. It was October 2008, and the whole world felt like it was falling apart. Banks were crashing, people were losing their homes, and everyone was scared as hell about what was coming next. Me? I was trying to make a living as a private tracker after leaving the Forest Service 3 years back. Sometimes I missed wearing the uniform, but after what happened in Yellowstone in '05, I needed to get away from all that bureaucratic bullshit and just focus on what I was good at, finding people who didn't want to be found. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I was sipping coffee in my cabin outside Port Angeles, checking emails on my laptop. Yeah, I'd finally joined the 21st century, when my phone started ringing. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize, but something about the way it rang seemed urgent. You know how sometimes you just feel it in your gut? "Turner here," I answered, and immediately heard this woman crying on the other end. "Please," she said, her accent thick with grief. "Please, you have to help us. Our daughter, she's missing." Now, I've gotten plenty of calls like this over the years, but there was something different about this one. The raw desperation in that mother's voice, it grabbed me by the throat and wouldn't let go. I could hear a man in the background speaking rapid Mandarin and then another voice, younger, pleading in English. "Ma'am, slow down," I said, grabbing a pen. "Tell me your name." "Linda Chen. My daughter is Sarah. Sarah Chen. She's been missing for 3 days. 3 days. In the Olympics in October, that might as well be 3 weeks. The weather'd been turning nasty. temperatures dropping into the 30s at night, and we'd had 2 solid days of rain. If she was out there somewhere, hypothermia was going to be a real problem. Where was she last seen? I asked, already mentally cataloging my gear. Olympic National Park. She was doing research for her graduate thesis at University of Washington, forest ecology. She was supposed to check in every evening, but her voice broke completely then. I could hear the younger voice again, her brother, I figured, taking the phone. Mr. Turner, this is David Chen, my sister. She's not the type to just disappear. She's responsible, careful, something's wrong. And that's when I knew I was going to take the case. See, I'd lost my own sister when I was younger. Different circumstances, but the pain in that family's voices brought it all back. Some jobs you take for money, others you take 'cause something inside you won't let you walk away. I'll be there in 2 hours, I told them. The drive to their house in Sequim gave me time to think about what I was walking into. Sarah Chen, 26, graduate student, researching forest ecosystems. Smart girl, probably thought she knew the woods better than she did. I'd seen it before. Educated folks who understood trees and soil composition but didn't understand that the forest could kill you in about 100 different ways if you weren't careful. When I pulled up to the Chen house, I could see the family standing at the window. The moment I stepped out of my truck, they were on the porch. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, probably in their 50s, and David, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Mrs. Chen grabbed my arm the second I got close enough. "You find her," she said, eyes red and swollen from crying. "We came to America with nothing so she could have opportunities. She's all we have." Now that broke something in me right there. But Mr. Chen stepped forward and shook my hand with the kind of grip that told me he was barely holding himself together. "Sarah is brilliant," he said, PhD candidate in forest ecology. She knows plants, trees, ecosystems. But maybe she doesn't know dangerous people. That caught my attention. "What makes you say that?" David pulled out his phone, one of those new iPhones that were still pretty rare, and showed me Sarah's last text message. It was from 3 days ago around noon. "Found something interesting. Staying an extra day. Don't worry." "That's not like her," David said. "She always gives details. Always tells us exactly where she's going to be." I studied the message, and yeah, he was right. It felt wrong somehow. Too vague, too casual for someone who was supposed to check in regularly. "Show me her research area," I said. They spread out a topographic map on their kitchen table, and Mrs. Chen pointed to a section of forest about 15 miles into Olympic National Park. "Here," she said. She was studying old-growth forest recovery patterns. She had permits to camp here for a week. I looked at the area. Dense forest, steep terrain, multiple creek systems. Perfect place to get lost if you didn't know what you were doing. Also, perfect place for someone to hide if they wanted to. "Has she had any problems with anyone lately? Strange phone calls? Someone following her, anything like that?" The family exchanged glances, and I could tell there was something they weren't saying. "Tell me," I said. Mrs. Chen wrung her hands. "Last month she mentioned someone at the university, a professor who made her uncomfortable, but she didn't give details." "What kind of uncomfortable?" "She said he asked too many personal questions, about her research, about where she went alone in the forest. She thought maybe he was interested in her work, but she felt like he was interested in more than that," I finished. David nodded. "She's pretty good at reading people. If something felt off to her, it probably was." I spent another hour with them, getting details about Sarah's equipment, her experience level, her habits. She was more prepared than I'd initially thought. She had good gear, knew basic survival skills, and had been hiking since she was a kid. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that she hadn't just gotten lost. By the time I loaded my truck with gear and headed for the trailhead, it was already 2 in the afternoon. October days are short, and I'd only have about 3 hours of decent light. But I needed to get started. Every hour that passed made Sarah's chances worse. The parking area where Sarah had left her car was about 12 miles up a winding Forest Service road. Her little Honda Civic was still there, covered with 3 days' worth of fallen leaves. The sight of it made my chest tight. It looked abandoned, forgotten. I did a quick inspection of the car. No signs of struggle, no broken windows, keys weren't inside. Whatever had happened to Sarah, it hadn't started here. I strapped on my pack and checked my gear one more time. GPS unit, radio, first aid kit, emergency shelter, 3 days' worth of food, and my Glock. Yeah, I'd started carrying after what happened in Yellowstone. The Forest Service had policies about that, but I wasn't Forest Service anymore. The trail started out easy enough, well-maintained path through second-growth forest, but about a mile in I came across Sarah's first campsite. Her tent was still there, but something about it made my skin crawl. See, I've always had this thing where I can sense when people have been somewhere recently. Don't ask me to explain it scientifically. It's just something I've been able to do since I was a kid. And this campsite felt wrong. The tent was set up perfectly, too perfectly. Guy lines were exactly the right tension. Rainfly was positioned just right. Even the rocks around the fire ring were arranged in a neat circle. Sarah might have been organized, but this looked like someone had staged it. I circled the campsite slowly, letting my eyes adjust to what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the footprints. Now, most people would have missed them. 3 days of rain and wind had washed out most of the obvious tracks. But I've been tracking things through forests for over 15 years, and I know how to read the subtle signs that weather can't erase completely. There were Sarah's prints, small hiking boots, size 7 maybe, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel, but there were others too. Larger prints, maybe size 10 or 11, with a completely different tread pattern. And here's what made my blood run cold. The larger prints circled Sarah's campsite multiple times, like someone had been watching her for a while before making contact. I knelt down next to the clearest print I could find. The sole pattern was from an expensive hiking boot, Vask or Salomon maybe. Whoever this was had good gear and knew how to move quietly through the forest. The stride length and depth told me it was probably a man, around 6 feet tall, maybe 180 pounds. But here's the thing that really bothered me. The prints were too perfect. Like someone had been very careful about where they stepped, very aware of what kind of tracks they were leaving. In my experience, people who are that careful about their footprints are usually up to no good. I followed the combined trail away from the campsite. Sarah's prints and the larger ones moved together for about 50 yards before disappearing onto rocky ground. But I could still follow them. It's amazing what you can see when you know how to look. A scuff mark on a root here, a disturbed patch of moss there, a pebble pushed out of place. The trail led uphill away from the main path and into thicker forest. After about 20 minutes of tracking, I found something that made my stomach clench up tight. Sarah's water bottle. Just sitting there on a fallen log like someone had placed it deliberately. I approached it carefully, not touching anything at first. The bottle was about half full and didn't look like it had been there long. No leaves inside, no obvious weather damage. But why would Sarah leave it behind? And why right there, in such an obvious spot? I was starting to get a real bad feeling about this whole situation. I pulled out my radio and tried to contact the local ranger station. Nothing but static. My cell phone showed no signal. Not unusual this deep in the Olympics, but frustrating as hell when you needed to report what you were finding. I marked the GPS coordinates of the water bottle and continued following the trail. The tracks were getting harder to follow as the terrain got rockier, but I could still make out the general direction they were headed. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the forest. Mechanical, rhythmic, like someone hammering something metal. It was faint, maybe a quarter mile ahead, but in the complete silence of the deep woods, it stood out like a gunshot. I froze, listening hard. The sound came again. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. Definitely man-made, definitely close enough that whoever was making it might be able to hear me if I wasn't careful. I started moving more slowly, placing each step carefully to avoid cracking twigs or rustling leaves. The sound kept coming every few minutes, always from the same direction. As I got closer, I could tell it was coming from somewhere downhill, probably near the creek I'd been hearing in the distance. The forest was getting thicker, and the afternoon light was starting to fade. I checked my watch, 4:30 p.m. I had maybe an hour of decent light left, and then I'd be moving around in the dark with just my headlamp. I was about 100 yards from where I thought the sound was coming from when I saw the smoke. Just a thin wisp, barely visible against the gray sky, but definitely there. Someone had a fire going. Could be Sarah, could be some other hiker, or could be whoever left those footprints back at the campsite. I worked my way down toward the creek as quietly as I could. The sound was getting clearer now. Definitely metal on metal, like someone was driving stakes or maybe working on some kind of construction project. Through the trees, I could make out a clearing next to the creek. There was definitely someone there. I could see movement through the gaps in the forest, but I couldn't get a clear view without getting a lot closer. I found a good spot behind a massive cedar tree and pulled out my binoculars. From there, I could see into the clearing pretty well. What I saw made me understand that Sarah Chen wasn't just lost. There was a man there, maybe 40 years old, medium build, working on something near the creek. He had dark hair and was wearing expensive outdoor gear, the kind of stuff that costs more than most people make in a week. But it wasn't the man that made my blood freeze. It was what he was building. Next to the creek, he'd constructed some kind of shelter that looked way too elaborate for regular camping. It was built into the hillside, partially underground, with a sophisticated camouflage system that would make it nearly invisible from more than 50 feet away. This wasn't something you threw together for a weekend camping trip. This was permanent, or at least long-term. And there were tools. Lots of tools. More than anyone would need for camping or even extended wilderness living. I could see shovels, axes, coils of rope, and other things that I couldn't identify from my position. But the thing that made my hands start shaking was hanging from a tree branch about 10 feet from the shelter. Sarah's backpack. I watched the man for another 10 minutes trying to figure out what the hell I was dealing with. He moved around the campsite with the confidence of someone who'd been there for a while, someone who'd had time to get comfortable. Everything was organized, methodical, efficient. This wasn't some random encounter. This was planned. I needed to get closer, but I also needed to be smart about it. If this guy had Sarah, then one wrong move on my part could get her killed. I had to assume she was still alive. Maybe in that underground shelter, maybe tied up somewhere I couldn't see. I worked my way around the clearing, staying well back in the trees, trying to get a view of the shelter entrance. The man had disappeared inside, but I could hear him moving around, maybe talking to someone. My radio crackled suddenly, and I damn near jumped out of my skin. Someone was trying to reach me, but all I could make out was static and a few broken words. I turned the volume down quick and checked to make sure the sound hadn't carried to the clearing. The man's head popped out of the shelter entrance. He was looking around, definitely alert, definitely listening for something. After a few seconds, he stepped out completely and scanned the tree line. That's when I got my first clear look at his face, and something about it seemed familiar. Not like I'd met him before, but like I'd seen a picture somewhere, maybe heard a description. He was older than I'd initially thought, probably late 40s or early 50s, with graying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. There was something about the way he carried himself that reminded me of the psychology professors I'd known in college. Confident, analytical, like he was always studying everything around him. And then it hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew who this was. 3 years ago, when I was still with the Forest Service, there'd been a case that had bothered me for months. A hiker had gone missing in the North Cascades, and we'd found evidence of foul play, but never found the hiker or caught whoever was responsible. During the investigation, we'd interviewed dozens of people, including some university professors who'd been in the area. One of them had been a psychology professor from University of Washington who'd been doing research on stress responses in wilderness environments. I remembered him because he'd seemed way too interested in the details of how people react when they're lost and scared. The interview had made me uncomfortable, but we'd had no evidence linking him to anything. Dr. Marcus Webb. That was his name. And unless I was losing my mind, that's who I was looking at right now. I needed to get Sarah out of there, but I also needed backup. My radio was useless, my cell phone had no signal, and it was getting dark fast. I was gonna have to make a choice. Try to handle this alone or hike back out and get help, which might mean leaving Sarah with this psycho for another whole night. Before I could make up my mind, I heard voices from the shelter. "Please," a woman's voice said, weak but definitely alive. "Please, I need water. Sarah. She was alive. Patience, came a man's voice. Calm, controlled, like he was talking to a research subject instead of a human being. We're making excellent progress. I need to document your responses at each stage of the process. Process. What the hell kind of process was he talking about? I crept closer, staying low and moving from tree to tree. I needed to see what was going on inside that shelter, needed to figure out how to get Sarah away from this maniac. From about 30 feet away, I could see through the entrance. The interior was bigger than it looked from outside. Carved into the hillside with what looked like professional excavation. There were battery-powered lights, folding tables covered with notebooks and equipment, and along one wall. Jesus Christ. Sarah was chained to the wall, not tied up, chained. Heavy metal restraints around her wrists and ankles, connected to eye bolts that had been drilled into the rock. She was still wearing her hiking clothes, but they were torn and dirty. Her face was pale, her lips were cracked, and she looked like she'd been there for days. But she was alive, and she was alert. Her eyes were tracking Webb's movements, and I could tell she was looking for any opportunity to escape. Webb was sitting at one of the tables writing in a notebook and occasionally looking at Sarah like she was a lab rat. Every few minutes he'd ask her a question. How would you rate your current level of fear on a scale of 1 to 10? Or, describe your primary concerns about your situation. He was studying her. This sick bastard was using her as a test subject for some kind of twisted psychological experiment. I'd seen enough. It was time to end this. I worked my way back into the trees and started planning my approach. Webb was armed. I'd seen a pistol on his belt, and he had the advantage of knowing the terrain around his camp. But I had advantages too. I knew he didn't know I was there, and I'd been moving through forests quietly for more years than I cared to count. The trick was going to be getting close enough to neutralize him without giving him a chance to hurt Sarah. Those chains meant she couldn't run, so if things went bad, she'd be stuck right in the middle of whatever happened. I circled around to approach from the backside of the shelter, where the entrance wouldn't be directly visible. The excavation had created a small rise that I might be able to use for cover. I was about 20 feet from the shelter when everything went to hell. My foot came down on what I thought was solid ground, but it was actually a thin covering over some kind of pit. The whole thing gave way, and I dropped about 4 feet into what felt like a deliberately constructed hole. The crash echoed through the forest like a gunshot. So much for the element of surprise. Well, well, Webb's voice called out, calm as you please. It sounds like we have a visitor. I scrambled out of the pit, which I now realized was some kind of trap. Not deep enough to seriously injure someone, but definitely designed to make noise if anyone stepped in it. This bastard had set up a perimeter alarm system. I know you're out there, Webb continued, his voice carrying easily through the trees. Why don't you come out where we can talk? I'd hate for Miss Chen to suffer because of your poor manners. I heard Sarah make a sound. Not quite a scream, but definitely distress. He was hurting her. Stop, I yelled, stepping out from behind the trees with my hands visible. I'm coming out. Webb emerged from the shelter entrance, and I could see he had his pistol drawn but pointed down at his side. His other hand was holding something, looked like some kind of remote control. Drop your weapon and step into the clearing, he said. Slowly. I unholstered my Glock and set it on the ground, then stepped away from it. Webb was staying near the shelter entrance, keeping Sarah between us. Very good, he said. Now, let me guess. You're Alex Turner, aren't you? The famous tracker. That caught me off guard. How the hell did he know my name? Surprised. Webb smiled, and it was one of the coldest expressions I'd ever seen. I've been following your career for some time, Mr. Turner. Your work in Yellowstone was particularly impressive. Such dedication to finding lost people even when it costs you personally. He knew about Yellowstone. He knew about what had happened to me there, about the case that had nearly destroyed my career and sent me into therapy for 2 years. What do you want? I asked. What I've always wanted, Webb said. To understand human behavior under extreme stress. To document how people react when pushed beyond their normal psychological limits. Sarah here has been an excellent subject, but I must admit, I was hoping for something more challenging. You son of a bitch. Now, no need for profanity. This is a scientific endeavor. He gestured toward the shelter. Please step inside. I think you'll find my work quite fascinating. I didn't have much choice. He had the gun, he had Sarah, and he clearly had more surprises waiting if I tried anything stupid. I walked toward the shelter entrance, keeping my hands visible. The inside was even more elaborate than I'd realized. Webb had been building this place for months, maybe years. There were shelves lined with notebooks, video cameras mounted on tripods, and monitoring equipment that looked like it belonged in a hospital. Sarah looked up as I entered. Her eyes were bright with fever, and I could see infected cuts on her wrists where the chains had rubbed them raw. "Are you okay?" I asked her. She nodded weakly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I tried to get away, but he—" "Shh," Webb interrupted. "Please don't spoil the experiment by sharing information inappropriately." He gestured for me to sit in a folding chair near the center of the room. "Mr. Turner, you're going to be a wonderful addition to this study." "What study?" Webb's eyes lit up like I'd asked his favorite question. "I'm investigating the psychological breaking point of highly capable individuals. People like Sarah, intelligent, educated, resourceful. People like you, experienced, skilled, confident in your abilities." He moved to one of his tables and picked up a thick notebook. "The question is, what does it take to completely shatter someone's sense of control? How much stress, how much fear, how much hopelessness before the human mind simply gives up?" I was starting to understand what Sarah had been going through for the past 3 days. This sick bastard had been systematically terrorizing her, probably sleeping her, documenting her responses like she was a lab animal. "You're insane," I said. "Am I?" Webb sat down across from me, completely relaxed. "I have a PhD in clinical psychology from Stanford. I spent 15 years studying human behavior in controlled academic environments. But there's only so much you can learn in a laboratory, Mr. Turner. Real breakthroughs require real-world testing." "Real-world torture, you mean?" "Semantics." He waved dismissively. "The subjects always die eventually anyway. The question is what we can learn before that happens." Subjects, plural. Sarah wasn't his first victim. "How many?" I asked. Webb consulted his notebook. "Sarah is number 7. You'll be number 8, assuming you survive the initial phase long enough to provide useful data." 7 people. This monster had killed 7 people, and nobody even knew they were connected. "The authorities will figure it out eventually," I said. "Too many missing persons in the same area." "Will they?" Webb smiled again. "I've been very careful about geographic distribution. Different parks, different states, different victim profiles, and of course I've had help." Help? What the hell did that mean? Before I could ask, Webb stood up and moved to another table. "But enough exposition. We need to begin your evaluation." He picked up what looked like a cattle prod. "Let's start with your baseline fear response." That's when I realized I was about to find out exactly what Sarah had been going through. The next few hours were the worst of my life. Webb wasn't just torturing us for fun. He was systematic about it, clinical. He had charts and graphs, carefully calibrated levels of pain and psychological pressure. He would hurt one of us and then document how the other reacted. He shocked me with that cattle prod until I passed out, then revived me and started over. He showed Sarah videos of what he'd done to his previous victims, watching her face carefully and taking notes on her reactions. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the psychological games. Webb was brilliant, and he knew exactly how to get inside your head. He'd learned things about both of us, personal details about our fears, our families, our worst memories, and he used that knowledge like a scalpel. He knew about my sister's death when I was 14. He knew about what happened in Yellowstone, about the hiker I'd failed to find in time. He knew about Sarah's parents, about how much pressure she felt to succeed, about her fear of disappointing them. And he used all of it. "Your parents sacrificed everything for you," he told Sarah while I was chained up watching. They came to America with nothing so you could have opportunities. And look how you've repaid them. You're going to die in this cave, and they'll never even know what happened to you. Your sister died because you weren't there to protect her, he told me while Sarah sobbed in the corner. Just like you weren't there to save that hiker in Yellowstone. And now you're not going to be able to save Sarah either. You're going to watch her die knowing it's your fault for not being better at your job. By midnight, we were both broken. Sarah had stopped responding to his questions, just staring at the wall with empty eyes. I couldn't feel my hands anymore from the shocks, and my throat was raw from screaming. That's when Webb made his mistake. He got overconfident, started talking about his previous victims, about how none of them had lasted as long as we had. He was impressed, he said. We were exceeding his expectations. The hiker in North Cascades only lasted 18 hours, he said, checking his notes. The couple from Oregon made it to 36 hours before they completely broke down. But you two, you're already at 48 hours and still maintaining some psychological cohesion. He was so focused on his data that he didn't notice I'd been working on the chain around my right wrist for the past hour. The shackle was old, and the repeated shocks had made my wrist swell up enough that I could slip it if I was willing to dislocate some bones. Of course, Webb continued. The real test will be when I start the final phase. That's when I find out which one of you is willing to sacrifice the other to end their own suffering. He moved towards Sarah with some kind of injector, probably more drugs to keep her compliant. That's when I made my move. I dislocated my thumb and slipped out of the right shackle, which gave me enough mobility to reach the cattle prod he'd left on the table next to me. The pain in my hand was incredible, but pain was just information, and right now, I needed to act on that information. Webb turned around just as I grabbed the prod. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely surprised. Now that's interesting, he said, reaching for his pistol. I didn't think you had that in you. I jammed the cattle prod into his ribs and hit the button. The shock dropped him like a rock, his gun skittering across the floor toward Sarah. "Sarah!" I yelled. "The gun!" She looked up, dazed, then saw the pistol. Even chained up, she could reach it if she stretched. Webb was convulsing on the floor, but he'd be back up in a few seconds. Sarah got the gun just as Webb started moving again. She pointed it at him with shaking hands. "Kill him," I said. She stared at Webb, who was slowly getting to his knees. Her finger was on the trigger, but she hesitated. I can't," she whispered. "I can't kill someone." Webb smiled, even while he was still twitching from the shock. "Fascinating. Even after everything I've done to her, she still has moral constraints. The human capacity for ethical behavior under extreme duress is truly remarkable. Even now, he was treating us like lab rats." "Give me the gun," I said. Sarah handed it over, and I pointed it at Webb's head. He looked up at me with those cold, analytical eyes, still fascinated by what was happening. "Go ahead," he said. "Though I should mention that killing me won't solve your problems. I told you I had help, remember?" "What kind of help?" Webb struggled to his feet, still smiling. "Did you really think I could do this alone? 7 victims over 3 years and nobody ever connected the cases? Someone's been helping me choose targets, providing logistical support, even cleaning up loose ends when necessary." My blood went cold. "Who?" "Someone with access to missing person reports. Someone who knows which cases get investigated thoroughly and which ones get forgotten. Someone with the authority to misdirect searches when necessary. Law enforcement. Someone in law enforcement was helping him." "That's why your radio didn't work earlier," Webb continued. "That's why nobody's coming to look for you. My partner made sure you'd be completely isolated out here." I was still pointing the gun at him, but now I was starting to understand the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one psycho with a twisted research project. This was a conspiracy, and I had no idea how far it went. "Who is it?" I demanded. Webb shook his head. "I'm afraid that information is above your clearance level." I was about to pull the trigger when I heard footsteps outside the shelter. Heavy boots on the rocky ground, moving fast. "Alex!" a voice called out. "Alex, are you in there?" I recognized the voice. It was Ray Morrison, the head ranger at Olympic National Park. I'd worked with him for 2 years when I was still with the Forest Service, and he'd been the one who'd recommended me to the Chen family. Relief flooded through me. Help had finally arrived. "Ray!" I yelled back. "In here! I've got the suspect in custody!" Ray appeared in the shelter entrance, wearing full tactical gear and carrying an AR-15. Behind him were 2 other people in similar gear, probably FBI or state police. "Thank God," I said, lowering my weapon. "This sick bastard has been torturing." That's when I saw the expression on Ray's face. He wasn't looking at Webb like he was a criminal. He was looking at me like I was the problem. "I'm sorry, Alex," Ray said quietly. "I really am." And that's when I understood. Ray Morrison was Webb's partner. The head ranger at Olympic National Park, the man I'd trusted, the man who'd recommended me to the Chen family, had been helping Webb select and isolate victims for 3 years. Everything clicked into place. The radio dead zones that were never fixed. The search protocols that somehow never covered the right areas. The missing person cases that got shifted to low priority for budgetary reasons. Ray had been sabotaging investigations from the inside, and I'd been too stupid to see it. "Why?" I asked. Ray's shoulders sagged. "You wouldn't understand. Try me." "Marcus is brilliant," Ray said, glancing at Webb. "His research, it could revolutionize our understanding of human psychology. Think about what we could learn about survival, about resilience, about how people react in crisis situations. By torturing innocent people? By studying human behavior in its purest form, without the constraints of ethics committees and institutional review boards." Ray's voice was gaining strength, like he was convincing himself as much as me. "The subjects were going to die anyway. Hikers get lost. People disappear in the wilderness all the time. At least this way, their deaths serve a greater purpose." I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. "You're both insane." "No," Webb interjected, straightening his clothes. "We're scientists, and you, Mr. Turner, have become a liability." Ray raised his rifle, pointing it directly at my chest. "I'm sorry it has to end this way, Alex. I always liked you. What about Sarah?" "Miss Chen will continue to be part of the study for as long as she's useful," Webb said. "Though I suspect her psychological breaking point is very close now." I looked at Sarah, still chained to the wall, staring at us with wide, terrified eyes. She'd heard everything, understood that the cavalry wasn't coming to save us. If anything, our situation had just gotten worse. But something in her expression reminded me of my sister. The same determination, the same refusal to give up even when everything looked hopeless. And I realized I still had one advantage that Webb and Morrison didn't know about. Earlier, when I'd been working on getting out of the shackle, I'd also managed to activate the emergency beacon on my GPS unit. It was in my backpack, which Morrison's people had confiscated, but the signal would have been transmitting for the past 2 hours. The FBI had protocols for missing federal contractors. When someone with my clearance level disappeared, it triggered automatic search procedures that even Morrison couldn't shut down. Help was coming. I just had to keep us alive long enough for it to arrive. "You know what I think?" I said to Morrison. "I think you're full of shit." Morrison frowned. "What?" "All this talk about scientific advancement and greater purposes. You're not doing this for science. You're doing it because you get off on it." "That's not true." "Really? Then why do you need 7 victims to figure out how people react to stress? Any first-year psychology student could tell you that people get scared when you hurt them. You're not learning anything new. You're just enjoying the process." I could see Morrison's grip tighten on his rifle. I was getting to him. "You want to know what I learned about you in the past 10 minutes? I continued. "You're a coward. You let Webb do all the dirty work while you sit back and play cleanup crew. You probably never even watch what he does to people because you don't have the stomach for it. Shut up. That's why you need the justifications about scientific research, because deep down, you know you're just helping a sadistic psychopath torture innocent people, and you can't live with that knowledge unless you pretend it's for some noble cause." Morrison's face was getting red. "Good. Angry people make mistakes." I said, "Shut up. The truth is you're weak. You always were weak. That's why you never made it past head ranger. You don't have what it takes to make the hard decisions, so you attach yourself to someone like Webb and pretend his strength is yours. That did it. Morrison stepped toward me, rifle raised, finger on the trigger, which is exactly what I'd been hoping for. See, Morrison had made the same mistake that a lot of people make when they're dealing with someone they think is helpless. He'd forgotten that I still had one hand free, and that I'd been palming the cattle prod this whole time. When Morrison got close enough, I jammed the prod into his thigh and held down the button. The shock went right through his tactical gear and dropped him like a stone. His rifle clattered across the floor. Webb lunged for the weapon, but Sarah had managed to stretch far enough to kick it away from him. It slid into a corner where none of us could reach it easily. I grabbed Morrison's sidearm and pointed it at Webb. "Keys," I said. "Now." Webb hesitated for a second, then reached into his pocket and tossed me a key ring. I unlocked Sarah's restraints, and she collapsed into my arms. "Are you okay?" I asked. She nodded, though she was shaking so hard she could barely stand. I thought we were gonna die. Not today. Morrison was starting to come around, moaning and twitching on the ground. I zip-tied his hands behind his back with restraints from his own tactical belt. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked. Before I could answer, I heard the sound I'd been waiting for all night. Helicopters, multiple helicopters, getting closer fast. "Now we wait for the real cavalry to arrive," I said. 20 minutes later, the forest around Webb's shelter was crawling with FBI agents, state police, and paramedics. My emergency beacon had done exactly what I'd hoped it would. Triggered a massive search and rescue operation that Morrison couldn't interfere with. Webb and Morrison were both arrested on the spot. Webb immediately started demanding a lawyer, but Morrison just sat there staring at the ground like he couldn't believe what had happened. Sarah was airlifted to Olympic Medical Center in Port Angeles. She had hypothermia, dehydration, and a bunch of infected cuts, but the doctor said she was going to be fine physically. The psychological trauma, well, that was going to take longer to heal. I rode with her in the helicopter, holding her hand while the paramedics worked on her IV. She kept thanking me, but honestly, she'd saved herself as much as I'd saved her. If she hadn't been strong enough to hang on for 3 days, if she hadn't been brave enough to grab Morrison's rifle when I needed her to, neither of us would have made it out alive. The Chen family was waiting at the hospital when we arrived. Mrs. Chen broke down crying the moment she saw Sarah, and Mr. Chen just stood there shaking his head like he couldn't believe his daughter was really safe. David grabbed my arm as the paramedics wheeled Sarah into the emergency room. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for bringing her home." I spent the next 3 days giving statements to federal investigators. The case was bigger than I'd realized. Webb's research had connected to missing person cases across 7 different states, and there were probably other victims that hadn't been found yet. Morrison's cooperation led them to 2 more burial sites in the Olympic National Forest. They found remains, personal belongings, and more of Webb's meticulous documentation of what he'd done to people. The worst part was discovering how long it had been going on. Morrison had been feeding Webb information about vulnerable targets for nearly 5 years. Hikers who were traveling alone, researchers who were working in isolated areas, people whose disappearances wouldn't trigger immediate massive search efforts. Webb got life without parole. Morrison got 25 to life. Both of them are going to die in prison, which is exactly what they deserve. Sarah recovered physically, but it took her almost a year of therapy before she felt comfortable going into the forest again. She finished her graduate degree and became a professor herself, environmental science at University of Washington. She still sends me Christmas cards, and she always includes a picture of whatever research she's working on. She never hikes alone anymore. As for me, well, this case changed everything. The FBI offered me a job as a consultant on missing person cases, specializing in situations where foul play might be involved. I took it, and I've been doing that work ever since. I've learned that there are monsters walking around in human skin, people who look perfectly normal but who've given up everything that makes us human. Some of them are brilliant, like Webb. Some of them are cowards, like Morrison, but all of them have one thing in common. They prey on people who trust them. The trick is learning to spot them before they spot you. That's why I'm telling you this story, because somewhere out there, there's another Webb, another Morrison, another monster pretending to be just another person you might meet on a trail or in a campground. And maybe if you know what to look for, you'll see them coming before it's too late. Stay alert out there. Trust your instincts. And remember, sometimes the person offering to help is the last person you should trust, because the worst predators are the ones who know exactly how to make you feel safe. My name is Ben Fletcher, and I'm going to tell you about the worst damn day of my life. Hell, the worst 4 days if I'm being honest. This happened back in October 2008, right when everything was going to shit with the economy, banks failing left and right, and people losing their houses. But none of that mattered when I got that phone call at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would change everything I thought I knew about the world. I'd been a forest ranger for 7 years by then, working mostly in the Olympic Peninsula here in Washington. At 34, I thought I'd seen it all. Lost hikers, drug operations, the occasional suicide. But I had this thing, see? This ability to find people when nobody else could. I could track footprints that others missed completely, read signs in nature that most folks would walk right past. My old supervisor used to joke that I had some kind of sixth sense, but it wasn't a joke to me. I developed these skills through years of wandering those forests, learning to notice when something was wrong, when the animals were acting strange, when the very air itself felt different. And that morning, I was about to need every single one of those abilities more than I ever had before. The call came from Detective Ray Martinez with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Ben, we got a missing person case that's got everyone stumped. PhD student from University of Washington. Been missing 4 days now. Family's going crazy, and we need someone with your particular talents. See, by 2008, I'd built a reputation. After leaving the Park Service the year before, I'd gone freelance, helping families find their loved ones when the official search and rescue teams came up empty. The Chen family had heard about me through some professor friend, and they were desperate, and I mean desperate. The kind that makes your stomach twist up just hearing it in someone's voice. Sarah Chen was 28, a PhD student in environmental biology who'd been conducting field research in the deeper parts of Olympic National Park. She'd been studying the effects of climate change on old-growth forest ecosystems, specifically focusing on how rising temperatures were affecting moss and lichen growth patterns. Smart girl, dedicated to her work, the kind who'd stay out longer than she should to get the perfect data samples. She'd been expected back at her research station 4 days ago, but never showed up. Her emergency beacon had gone silent, her cell phone was dead, and her rental car was still parked at the Solduke trailhead where she'd left it. When I met with the family that first day, Jesus Christ, it broke something in me. Mr. and Mrs. Chen had immigrated from Taiwan in the early 80s with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a dream that their kids would have better lives than they did. They'd worked 16-hour days running a small grocery store in Seattle, saving every penny to put Sarah through school. She was their pride and joy, the first in their family to get a PhD, and now she was missing in terrain that could kill an experienced hiker, let alone a bookish graduate student. Mrs. Chen couldn't stop crying. She kept showing me pictures of Sarah, graduation from undergrad, acceptance into the PhD program, fieldwork photos where she was grinning next to some massive Douglas fir. "She's so smart," Mrs. Chen kept saying in her accented English. "She know forest, she careful. Something bad happened to her. Please, Mr. Fletcher, please find my daughter." But it was David, Sarah's younger brother, who really got to me. 25 years old, worked as a software engineer at Microsoft, making more money than his parents had ever dreamed of. He was trying to hold it together for them, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "She wouldn't just disappear," he told me, gripping my arm with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Sarah's the most responsible person I know. If she's not back, it's because something happened to her. Something bad. That kind of desperation, that raw fear, it gets under your skin and stays there." These weren't just clients anymore. They were a family watching their world fall apart. and they'd put all their faith in me to put it back together. The pressure was like a weight on my chest, but it also sharpened my focus in a way I'd never experienced before. I started at the Salt Duke trailhead where Sarah's Honda Civic was still parked, covered in 4 days' worth of autumn rain. The car was unlocked. First red flag right there. Sarah might have been naive about some things, but she was a city girl who knew better than to leave her car unlocked in a remote location. Inside, I found her purse with wallet, keys, and a cell phone with a dead battery. But her research notebook was missing, along with her camera and GPS unit. Someone who knew what they were doing would take exactly those items, the things that might contain information about where she'd been planning to go. The trail itself told a story that made my blood run cold. Sarah's footprints were clear enough in the soft earth near the trailhead, but about 2 miles in they were joined by a second set. Larger boots, expensive ones from the tread pattern, walking parallel to hers for about 50 yards before they converged. Now I've seen thousands of footprint patterns over the years, and there's a difference between coincidental encounters and predatory behavior. These prints showed classic stalking behavior. The second person maintaining distance, matching pace, waiting for the right moment. The convergence point was at a small clearing where Sarah had obviously stopped to take samples. I found disturbed moss where she'd been working, and traces of her equipment scattered around, but no signs of struggle, which bothered me more than a fight would have. A struggle means resistance, means the victim had a chance. The absence of struggle suggested either complete surprise or someone Sarah had trusted enough to let get close. That's when my phone rang. Mrs. Chen's voice was barely a whisper. "Mr. Fletcher? You find something? Please tell me you find something." I couldn't tell her what I'd really found. Evidence that her daughter had likely encountered someone with predatory intentions 3 miles deep in one of the most remote areas of the park. Instead, I said, "I'm following her trail, Mrs. Chen. She's a smart girl and she left good signs for me to follow." But following that trail was like descending into hell one step at a time. The dual set of footprints led deeper into the old-growth sections where the canopy blocked out most of the daylight even at noon. This was terrain that even experienced hikers avoided. Steep ravines, deadfall that could trap you, and so many false trails that you could wander for days without finding your way back to civilization. But Sarah had been led this way, and I was starting to understand that it hadn't been by accident. About 5 miles from the trailhead, I found her first piece of equipment. Her GPS unit smashed to pieces and scattered across a fallen log like some kind of twisted offering. The destruction was methodical, deliberate, each component separated and broken individually. This wasn't the work of an animal or an accident. Someone had taken time to ensure that every piece of technology that could lead searchers to Sarah was completely destroyed. But here's the thing about tracking that most people don't understand. It's not just about following footprints. It's about reading the entire environment, understanding how every element fits together to tell a story. And the story these woods were telling me was getting darker by the hour. The animals were wrong. Completely wrong. I'd been walking for 3 hours and hadn't seen a single bird, hadn't heard a single squirrel chattering, hadn't even seen the flash of a chipmunk's tail. The forest was dead quiet in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Animals know when there's a predator in their territory, and they react by getting the hell out of the area or hunkering down in their nests until the danger passes. This level of animal silence meant there was something in these woods that had every living creature terrified. The footprint pattern was changing too. What had started as 2 people walking together was becoming something else entirely. Sarah's prints were showing signs of exhaustion, deeper impressions, longer stride indicating stumbling, occasional handprints where she'd caught herself from falling. But the second set of prints remained steady, controlled, almost casual. Whoever was with Sarah wasn't struggling at all. They knew exactly where they were going and they were in complete control of the situation. I found her camera bag hanging from a tree branch about 8 feet off the ground. The bag itself was intact, but the camera had been removed. What kind of person carefully hangs someone's bag in a tree instead of just throwing it away? Someone who wanted it to be found, that's who. Someone playing a game. That realization hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. This wasn't a random encounter with a dangerous person. This was planned, calculated. Sarah Chen hadn't disappeared. She'd been taken by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and they wanted people to know it. They wanted me to know it. My phone had 1 bar of service, enough to get through to Detective Martinez. "Ray, I need you to run background checks on anyone who might have known Sarah's research schedule. This wasn't random." "What are you thinking, Ben?" "I'm thinking somebody's been watching her, learning her routines, waiting for the perfect opportunity, and I'm thinking they're still out here somewhere, watching me follow their breadcrumb trail." That's when everything started falling apart. My GPS unit started acting up first, the display flickering, coordinates jumping randomly, battery draining at an impossible rate. These were expensive units, military-grade equipment that I'd never had problems with before. But out there in those woods, it was failing in ways that defied explanation. Then my radio started cutting out, reducing my communication with Martinez to sporadic bursts of static-filled conversation. The weather was turning too, and turning fast. What had started as a typical October day in western Washington, overcast but dry, was becoming something altogether more sinister. The wind was picking up, cold enough that I could see my breath, and the sky was darkening with the kind of clouds that promise serious rain. But it wasn't just the weather that was wrong, it was the timing. Weather patterns don't change that rapidly without major atmospheric disturbances, and there hadn't been any storm systems in the forecast. I was about 7 miles from the trailhead when I found the first piece of Sarah's clothing. Her jacket, North Face rain gear that probably cost more than some people made in a week, hanging from a branch in perfect condition. No tears, no dirt, no signs that it had been removed under duress. It had been placed there deliberately, carefully positioned so that anyone following the trail would see it immediately. And that's when I heard the voice. "You're very good at this, Mr. Fletcher." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, seeming to echo off the massive tree trunks surrounding me. I spun in a circle, hand moving instinctively toward the knife on my belt, but I couldn't see anyone. The forest was still that unnatural dead quiet. But now I knew why. There was a predator here, and he was talking to me. I have to say I'm impressed. Most people would have given up hours ago, gone back to organize a proper search party with helicopters and dogs and all that bureaucratic nonsense. But you just keep following the trail I've left for you, very dedicated, very professional. The voice was educated, refined, with the kind of carefully modulated tone that professors use in lecture halls. But there was something else underneath it. Something cold and calculating that made every instinct I'd developed over 7 years in law enforcement scream danger. "Where is she?" I called out, still turning slowly, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice. "Where's Sarah?" "Oh, she's close, very close. In fact, she's been watching you for the last hour, haven't you, Sarah?" That's when I saw her, about 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a massive cedar trunk. Sarah Chen was standing perfectly still. She was wearing the same clothes described in her missing person report: jeans, hiking boots, a UW sweatshirt. But something was wrong with the picture. She wasn't tied up, wasn't showing signs of distress, wasn't even looking at me with recognition or hope. She was just standing there, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Sarah!" I shouted, starting toward her. "Sarah, it's okay, I'm here to help you." She didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even blink. I wouldn't approach her if I were you, Mr. Fletcher. You see, Sarah has been learning some very important lessons over the past 4 days. Lessons about trust, about assumptions, about the dangerous naivety of believing that intelligence and education can protect you from the realities of human nature. What did you do to her? The question came out as a growl, rage building in my chest like a pressure cooker about to explode. I taught her the truth about herself, about her family, about the lies she's been living her entire life. Would you like to know what I discovered about your precious missing victim, Mr. Fletcher? My radio crackled to life with Martinez's voice. "Ben, we ran those background checks. Nothing suspicious on anyone with access to Sarah's schedule, but we found something else. There's been a similar disappearance about 60 miles south of your location. Another graduate student missing for a week." The voice in the forest laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, Detective Martinez. Always so thorough. Always so dedicated to proper procedure. Tell me, Detective, did your background check reveal that Sarah Chen isn't quite who her family believes she is?" Through the static, I could hear Martinez rustling papers. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the devoted daughter, the brilliant scholar, the pride and joy of two hardworking immigrants has been living a very different life than the one her family knows about. Haven't you, Sarah?" Sarah finally moved, turning her head slightly toward the voice. Still no expression, still no indication that she was hearing any of this. She looked like she was sleepwalking, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. "You see, Mr. Fletcher, I've spent considerable time getting to know Sarah over the past 4 days. Getting to know who she really is underneath all that academic pretense and family loyalty. And what I've discovered is illuminating. My equipment was failing faster now. The GPS was completely dead, the radio producing nothing but static, and my cell phone showed no service at all. Even my digital camera was malfunctioning, the display showing error messages I'd never seen before. It was like the technology itself was being drained by some invisible force. But worse than the equipment failures was what was happening to my abilities, that tracking sense that had never failed me, that ability to read signs and patterns that others missed. It was being overwhelmed by the sheer wrongness of the situation. There were too many false trails, too many planted pieces of evidence, too many layers of deception. For the first time in my career, I felt completely lost. The other student Martinez mentioned, the voice continued conversationally, was named Jennifer Walsh, anthropology PhD from Western Washington University, very dedicated to her fieldwork, very committed to her research, just like Sarah. And just like Sarah, Jennifer had secrets her family knew nothing about. I forced myself to move toward Sarah, step by careful step. She watched me approach with those empty eyes, but she didn't run, didn't call for help, didn't show any recognition at all. It was like looking at a shell of a person, like whoever Sarah had been was gone, and something else was wearing her face. "What did you do to them?" I demanded, now close enough to see that Sarah was uninjured but somehow fundamentally different than the smiling girl in her family's photographs. "I showed them the truth, Mr. Fletcher. The truth about themselves, about their families, about the elaborate lies they'd constructed to maintain their false identities. You see, both Sarah and Jennifer were living double lives, taking money and support from families who had no idea who their daughters really were. That's impossible. I met the Chens. They're good people, hardworking people who've sacrificed everything for their daughter. Yes, they have sacrificed everything. Every penny they had, every hour they could work, every dream they might have had for their own lives. All of it poured into supporting their brilliant daughter's education. But Sarah hasn't been using that money for graduate school, has she, Sarah?" Sarah's mouth moved slightly, but no sound came out. Her eyes remained fixed on something in the distance, as if she was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. "Sarah Chen dropped out of the PhD program 18 months ago, Mr. Fletcher. She's been living in Portland, working as a dancer at a gentleman's club, using the money her parents send for tuition to pay for drugs and a lifestyle that would break their hearts. She only came back to Washington when she realized that someone had discovered her secret." The words hit me like physical blows. I looked at Sarah, searching her face for some sign that this was all lies, some indication that the voice was playing psychological games. But her expression remained empty, hollow, like she'd been drained of everything that made her human. Jennifer Walsh had a similar story. Full scholarship to graduate school, family convinced she was conducting groundbreaking research, but she'd been kicked out of the program for academic dishonesty. She'd been living on welfare and family money, maintaining the pretense while pursuing other interests. My radio crackled again, Martinez's voice barely audible through the static. "Ben, we're getting reports of severe weather moving into your area. You need to get out of there now." But I couldn't leave Sarah. Whatever had been done to her, whatever lies she might have told her family, she was still a human being who needed help, and her parents were still waiting for me to bring their daughter home. "Where's Jennifer Walsh now?" I asked, dreading the answer. Jennifer learned some very important lessons about honesty and accountability. She's resting now, in a place where her lies can't hurt anyone anymore. That's when it started raining. Not the gentle Pacific Northwest drizzle that locals barely notice, but a torrential downpour that seemed to come out of nowhere. Within minutes, the forest floor was turning to mud. Streams were forming where there had been dry ground, and visibility was dropping to just a few yards. And that's when my luck ran out completely. I was moving towards Sarah when my foot hit a patch of loose earth that had been weakened by the sudden rainfall. What should have been solid ground gave way, and I found myself sliding down a steep embankment, crashing through undergrowth and bouncing off rocks until I came to rest in a creek bed that had been dry an hour earlier and was now rushing with runoff from the storm. The fall left me dazed, bruised, and worst of all, completely turned around. In the space of 30 seconds, I'd lost all sense of direction, all visual contact with Sarah, and all ability to communicate with the outside world. My radio was dead. My phone was cracked and waterlogged, and my GPS was somewhere up on the ridge where I'd fallen from. I was hurt, lost, and for the first time in my career, genuinely scared. Not just for Sarah, but for myself. Because sitting there in that muddy creek bed, water rising around me and darkness closing in, I realized that this had all been planned. The equipment failures, the weather, the perfectly timed fall, none of it was coincidence. Someone had been watching me, studying my methods, learning my patterns just like they'd studied Sarah and Jennifer. And now I was exactly where they wanted me to be. Feeling helpless, Mr. Fletcher? The voice was closer now, maybe 20 yards away. I struggled to my feet, water streaming from my clothes, and tried to get my bearings. But the storm had transformed the landscape into something unrecognizable. Streams where there had been solid ground, waterfalls pouring off cliffs that had been invisible in the darkness, and everywhere the sound of rushing water that made it impossible to pinpoint the source of the voice. This is what they felt like, you know, Sarah and Jennifer. That moment when they realized that all their lies had finally caught up with them, that there was nowhere left to run, no one left to fool. The moment when they understood that their victims, their families, their professors, their friends, deserved justice. "You're insane," I shouted into the storm. "Even if what you're saying is true, that doesn't give you the right to hurt them. Doesn't it? What about the rights of the families who sacrificed everything based on lies? What about the rights of the institutions that wasted resources on students who weren't even enrolled? What about the rights of the taxpayers whose money funded scholarships that went to fraudsters?" I was trying to climb back up the embankment, but the rain had made the slope treacherous. Every time I got a few feet up, more earth would give way and I'd slide back down. My injured ribs were screaming with every movement, and my left ankle felt like it might be sprained. You want to know the truth about human nature, Mr. Fletcher? People are fundamentally dishonest. They lie to their families, they lie to their employers, they lie to themselves, and they only stop lying when they're forced to confront the consequences of their deception. "Where is she?" I demanded. "Where's Sarah?" "Sarah is learning the final lesson, the one about accepting responsibility for your actions." That's when I heard the scream. It wasn't Sarah's voice. It was raw, primal, the sound of someone in absolute terror. And it was coming from somewhere upstream, maybe a quarter-mile away. I forced myself to move, ignoring the pain in my ribs and ankle, fighting against the current that was getting stronger every minute. The scream came again, longer this time, and I could hear words in it. "Please, I'm sorry. I'll tell them everything. I'll fix it. Please don't." Then silence. Just the sound of rain and rushing water. I found her 10 minutes later, and the sight is something that'll haunt me for the rest of my life. Sarah Chen was standing in the middle of a natural pool, water up to her chest, arms raised above her head. But she wasn't trying to get out. She was just standing there like a statue, letting the water rise around her. "Sarah." I crashed through the undergrowth toward the pool, but stopped when I saw her face. Her eyes were open but empty, staring at something I couldn't see. Her mouth was moving slightly, but no sound was coming out. "She's catatonic, Mr. Fletcher, completely withdrawn from reality. It's a common response to psychological trauma, when the mind simply can't process what it's experiencing." I spun around, and there he was, About 30 yards away, standing under the shelter of a massive old-growth cedar, was a man in his 50s with graying hair and expensive outdoor gear. He looked like any other academic who spent his weekends hiking, the kind of professor you'd see leading student field trips or giving lectures on environmental science. "Dr. Marcus Webb," I said, recognizing him from somewhere but not able to place where. "Very good, though I'm surprised Detective Martinez's background check didn't turn up my connection to this case." "What connection?" "I used to be a professor at University of Washington, psychology department, until 3 years ago when a graduate student named Lisa Park killed my wife and daughter." The pieces started falling into place with horrible clarity. Dr. Marcus Webb. I'd seen his name in the news coverage of a tragic accident in 2005. A drunk driver had run a red light and slammed into his family's car, killing his wife and 8-year-old daughter instantly. The driver had been a graduate student who'd been drinking at a faculty party. "She got 3 years in minimum security prison," Webb continued, his voice eerily calm. "3 years for destroying my entire world. And when she got out, she went right back to school, got her degree, got a good job, started a new life as if nothing had happened. While I lost everything." "That doesn't justify this," I said, edging closer to Sarah. The water was up to her shoulders now and she still wasn't moving. "Doesn't it? Young academics who think their education makes them special, who think they can lie and cheat and hurt people without consequences, they're all the same. Sarah Chen stole thousands of dollars from her parents while pretending to be their pride and joy. Jennifer Walsh took a full scholarship that could have gone to an honest student. Lisa Park took my family. What did you do to Jennifer?" "I taught her the truth about accountability, just like I taught Sarah. Just like I'm going to teach every lying, cheating, selfish graduate student I can find until someone finally understands that actions have consequences." The water was up to Sarah's neck now and she still wasn't moving. I had to act, but Webb was positioned perfectly to stop me if I tried to reach her. He had all the advantages. Higher ground, dry clothes, and apparently some kind of weapon since I could see something glinting in his right hand. "You can't save her, Mr. Fletcher. Just like you couldn't save Jennifer. The water's too deep, the current's too strong, and Sarah doesn't want to be saved. She knows what she's done. She knows what her lies have cost her family." That's when something inside me snapped. Maybe it was hearing Mrs. Chen's desperate voice on the phone. Maybe it was seeing the proud way David had talked about his sister. Maybe it was just 7 years of dealing with predators who thought they were smarter than everyone else. But I wasn't going to stand there and watch Sarah Chen die because some broken psychology professor had decided to play judge, jury, and executioner. "You want to know about consequences?" I shouted, moving toward the pool. "Here's a consequence for you. I'm not giving up." I dove into the pool, fighting against the current to reach Sarah. The water was shockingly cold, fed by mountain streams that had been snow just days earlier. But I'd grown up swimming in these mountain lakes, and I knew how to move in water that could kill an inexperienced swimmer. Sarah didn't resist when I grabbed her, didn't help either. She was dead weight, her body limp and unresponsive. But she was breathing, and that was all that mattered. I managed to get my arm around her waist and started fighting toward the edge of the pool, but the current was stronger than I'd expected. Very noble, Mr. Fletcher, but ultimately, pointless. Webb was moving along the edge of the pool, keeping pace with my slow progress through the water. Up close, I could see that what I'd thought was a weapon was actually a syringe, and I had a sinking feeling that Sarah's catatonic state wasn't entirely psychological. "What did you give her?" "A mild paralytic. Nothing that will cause permanent harm, but enough to prevent her from saving herself. You see, I'm not a monster, Mr. Fletcher. I don't torture people for pleasure. I simply create situations where people have to face the consequences of their choices." I reached the edge of the pool and managed to get Sarah's head above water, but I couldn't lift her out. The bank was too steep, I was too injured, and the current was fighting me every second. Worse, I could feel my strength fading fast. The cold water was sapping my energy and my injured ribs were making it hard to breathe. "She could have told her parents the truth at any time," Webb continued conversationally. "Could have admitted that she'd dropped out of school, could have gotten help for her drug problem, could have taken responsibility for her lies. But she chose to keep deceiving them, keep taking their money, keep letting them sacrifice for something that didn't exist. People make mistakes, I gasped, still fighting to keep Sarah's head above water. That doesn't mean they deserve to die, don't they? What about my daughter? She was 8 years old, Mr. Fletcher, 8 years old, and she died because Lisa Park thought her social life was more important than being responsible behind the wheel of a car. Where was her second chance? I was losing the fight. The water was too cold, Sarah was too heavy, and I was too injured. In another few minutes, we were both going to drown, and Webb would disappear back into the forest with another successful lesson completed. But then something clicked in my mind. Something my old training officer had told me during my first year as a ranger. When you can't fight the environment, Fletcher, you use it. The current that was trying to drag us downstream, it wasn't random. Water always flows toward the lowest point, and in this terrain, that meant it was flowing toward the main creek system. If I could stop fighting the current and start using it, I might be able to get us to shallower water where I could stand up. I adjusted my grip on Sarah and stopped trying to swim toward the bank. Instead, I let the current carry us downstream while using my legs to push off the bottom and steer us toward the inside of the curve where the water would be shallower. Interesting strategy, Webb called from the bank. But the creek gets deeper downstream, not shallower. You're just postponing the inevitable. But he was wrong. I knew this drainage system, had hiked these trails for years. About 50 yards downstream, the creek split around a gravel bar that formed during spring runoff. If I could get us to that gravel bar, I could stand up and carry Sarah to safety. The key was timing. I had to ride the current through a narrow section where the water accelerated, then brake left toward the gravel bar before we got swept past it into the deeper water below. It was going to hurt. There were rocks in that current that could break bones, but it was our only chance. "Hold on, Sarah," I whispered, though I wasn't sure she could hear me. "This is going to get rough." I positioned myself so that my body would take the impact from any rocks, wrapped both arms around Sarah's torso, took the deepest breath I could manage, and let the current take us into the rapids. The next 30 seconds were pure chaos. Water over our heads, rocks slamming into my back and shoulders, the sound of rushing water so loud I couldn't hear my own thoughts. But I kept my grip on Sarah and kept steering us left, toward where I knew that gravel bar had to be. When my feet suddenly hit solid ground, I almost cried with relief. We'd made it to the gravel bar and the water was only waist deep. I was able to stand up and lift Sarah's head completely out of the water for the first time in what felt like hours. But Webb was there waiting for us. Very impressive, Mr. Fletcher. I have to admit, I underestimated your resourcefulness. He was standing on the bank about 10 feet away, and now I could see that he had more than just a syringe. There was a pistol in his left hand, pointed directly at us. "Here's what's going to happen," he continued in that same calm, professional tone. "You're going to put Sarah back in the water and swim to the far bank. Then you're going to walk away and forget you ever found us. Sarah will face the consequences of her lies, and you'll go home to tell her family that you did everything you could. Like hell. Mr. Fletcher, I don't want to hurt you. You're not one of my targets. You're just someone who got caught up in something bigger than yourself. But I will kill you if you force me to." I looked down at Sarah in my arms. The paralytic was wearing off. I could see awareness starting to return to her eyes, could feel muscle tone returning to her body. Whatever she'd done, whatever lies she'd told her family, she was still a person who deserved a chance to make things right. "You want to know about consequences?" I said, meeting Webb's eyes. "Here's one you didn't plan for. I'm not leaving without her." That's when Sarah spoke for the first time since I'd found her. Her voice was weak, slurred from the drug, but clear enough to understand. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about everything. I wanted to tell them, but I was scared they'd hate me." Webb's face twisted with rage. "Sorry isn't enough. Sorry doesn't undo the damage, doesn't give back what was stolen, doesn't bring back the dead." "You're right," Sarah whispered. "Sorry isn't enough, but it's a start." And that's when I realized what I had to do. Webb wasn't just a predator hunting students. He was a broken man who'd lost everything and was trying to find some way to make sense of his pain. The only way to stop him wasn't through violence or force, but by making him see that his victims were human beings. not just symbols of everything he'd lost. "Tell me about your daughter," I said. The request caught him off guard. "What? Your daughter? What was her name?" "Emma." The name came out like a prayer, like something sacred. Her name was Emma. What was she like? She was perfect, smart and funny and kind. She wanted to be a veterinarian because she loved animals. She had this stuffed elephant that she carried everywhere named Mr. Peanuts. His voice was breaking, the professional mask slipping away to reveal the grief underneath. "She sounds amazing," I said softly. "She sounds like the kind of kid who would want people to have second chances." "Don't." Webb's hand was shaking now, the pistol wavering. "Don't you dare tell me what my daughter would want." "I'm not telling you anything. I'm just saying that in my experience, kids see the world differently than adults do. They believe in forgiveness, in people being able to change and grow and become better than they were." Sarah was stronger now, able to support some of her own weight. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," she said, looking directly at Webb. "I was scared and ashamed, and I made terrible choices. But I was going to tell them. I was going to go home after this research trip and tell them everything." "Lies," Webb snarled. "More lies to save yourself." "Maybe," Sarah admitted, "but maybe not. Maybe I would have been brave enough to face what I'd done. We'll never know now, will we?" That seemed to hit Webb harder than any argument I could have made. He stood there for a long moment, rain streaming down his face, pistol still pointed at us but no longer steady. "She's not Lisa Park," I said gently. "She's not the person who killed your family. She's just a scared kid who made some bad choices and got in over her head. Just like Emma might have someday if she'd lived long enough to make mistakes. Emma never would have. Emma was 8 years old. You don't know what kind of person she would have grown up to be. Maybe she would have been perfect, but probably she would have been human. And humans make mistakes. The question is whether we deserve to die for them." Webb's face crumpled. "I miss them so much. My wife, my daughter, they were everything to me. And that girl, that drunk, selfish girl, took them away and got 3 years in prison. 3 years for destroying my entire world." "I know," I said. "I can't imagine that kind of pain. But this isn't bringing them back. This is just creating more victims, more families who lose someone they love." We stood there in the rain for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Webb with his gun, me holding Sarah in the middle of a mountain creek, all of us soaked and exhausted and broken in our own ways. Finally, Webb lowered the pistol. I can't do this anymore. I thought it would make the pain stop, but it doesn't. Nothing makes it stop." He sat down heavily on the bank, the gun falling from his fingers. "I killed Jennifer Walsh. She's buried about 2 miles north of here. I'll tell you exactly where." The confession hit me like a physical blow. I'd been hoping, despite everything, that Jennifer was still alive somewhere. But looking at Webb's face, I could see the truth of it in his eyes. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "Because she laughed," Webb said simply. "When I told her about Emma, about what her lies were costing her family, she laughed and said that at least her lies didn't hurt anyone. So I showed her what hurt really looked like." I helped Sarah to the shore, my mind racing through options. Webb had confessed to murder, but he was also clearly having some kind of mental breakdown. He needed help, not just punishment. "Dr. Webb," I said carefully, "I want you to put your hands behind your head and lie down on the ground." He looked up at me with eyes that had aged decades in the past few minutes. "Are you arresting me?" "I'm keeping you safe until help arrives. You're not well and you need treatment." "Treatment?" He laughed bitterly. 3 years of therapy after Emma died. 3 years of being told that grief is normal, that anger is normal, that I needed to find healthy ways to process my emotions. You know what I learned? I learned that therapists are just as full of shit as everyone else. But he laid down anyway, putting his hands behind his head like I'd asked. The fight had gone out of him completely, leaving behind just a broken man who'd lost everything that mattered to him. My radio crackled to life. Apparently, the storm was moving on and we were getting back into range. Ben, are you there? We've got search teams mobilizing, helicopters on standby as soon as the weather clears. Martinez, I said into the radio. I've got Sarah Chen. She's alive and relatively unharmed. I also have a suspect in custody who's confessed to the murder of Jennifer Walsh. We need medical attention and backup at... I gave him our GPS coordinates from memory, one of those abilities that the stress seemed to have enhanced rather than diminished. Medical's on the way. What's the condition of the suspect? I looked down at Webb, who was lying in the mud with rain streaming down his face. Psychological evaluation needed. Possible suicide risk. Sarah was sitting on a fallen log, color slowly returning to her face as the paralytic worked its way out of her system. Mr. Fletcher, she said quietly, I need to call my parents. I need to tell them the truth about everything. Are you sure you're ready for that conversation? No. But Dr. Webb was right about one thing. I can't keep lying to them. They deserve to know who their daughter really is. 30 minutes later, the cavalry arrived. EMTs, sheriff's deputies, and Detective Martinez himself, all slogging through the muddy forest to reach us. Webb was taken into custody without resistance. Sarah was checked over by the paramedics and pronounced physically unharmed, and I was treated for my various injuries: cracked ribs, sprained ankle, multiple lacerations, and mild hypothermia. But the hardest part was still to come. The Chen family was waiting at the hospital when we arrived. Mrs. Chen took one look at Sarah and burst into tears, holding her daughter like she'd never let go again. Mr. Chen stood back with tears streaming down his face, just grateful to have his child back alive. David was the first to notice that something was wrong. Sarah, what happened out there? You look different, Sarah finished. I look different because I am different. Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago. I watched from across the waiting room as Sarah told her parents the truth about her life over the past 18 months. Watched Mrs. Chen's face go from relief to confusion to heartbreak. Watched Mr. Chen's shoulders slump as he realized that everything he'd been working for, everything he'd sacrificed for, had been based on lies. But I also watched them choose love over disappointment. Watched them wrap their arms around their daughter and tell her that they'd figure it out together. Watched a family that had been built on deception begin the process of rebuilding itself on truth. Dr. Marcus Webb was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Jennifer Walsh and attempted murder in Sarah's case. His psychological evaluation revealed severe depression, PTSD, and what the doctors called complicated grief syndrome. Essentially, he'd never processed the loss of his family and had channeled his pain into a mission of vigilante justice. He pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but he also agreed to undergo treatment, and from what I heard later, he was making progress in dealing with his grief in healthier ways. Sarah Chen re-enrolled in college, not in the PhD program she'd lied about, but in a community college where she could get the help she needed to overcome her substance abuse issues and figure out what she really wanted to do with her life. Her parents downsized their business to help pay for her treatment, but they did it gladly. The family that emerged from that crisis was smaller, poorer but more honest than the one that had existed before. And me? I came out of those woods a different person than I'd gone in, not just because of the physical trauma, but because I'd learned something about the nature of human resilience, about how people can survive unimaginable loss and still choose to keep going, to keep trying to find meaning and purpose in a world that sometimes seems designed to break us. The abilities I'd always taken for granted, the tracking skills, the environmental awareness, the investigative instincts, they'd all been pushed to their limits and beyond. But they'd also been refined by the experience, sharpened into tools that would serve me well in the cases to come. Because there would be more cases, more missing persons, more families in crisis, more predators who thought they were smarter than the system, and I'd be ready for them, carrying the lessons I'd learned in those dark woods, remembering the sound of Mrs. Chen's desperate voice and the sight of a broken professor who'd let his grief turn him into the very thing he'd set out to punish. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, hearing that sound of rushing water and remembering the weight of Sarah Chen in my arms as I fought to keep her head above the surface. But I also remember the moment when she chose to tell her parents the truth, when a family decided that love was stronger than lies, when even a killer chose to confess rather than continue down his path of violence. Those memories, the good and the bad together, they're what keep me going when the next family calls with desperation in their voices and faith in their eyes. They're what remind me that no matter how dark the woods get, there's always a way back to the light if you're willing to keep fighting for it. My name is Ben Fletcher, and that was the story of the worst and best 4 days of my life. The days when I learned that finding someone who's lost isn't always about bringing them back home. Sometimes it's about helping them find their way to who they really are.